Most people aren't free, they're just well-trained. They wake up, clock in, follow rules, and call it freedom. But behind the polite routines and respectable titles lies a deeper truth no one teaches. That much of what we call life is performance, control, and illusion. In this video, we're diving into three of the most dangerous thinkers in history: Nietzsche, Foucault, and Schopenhauer. These aren't safe ideas. These are the thoughts society doesn't want you to have. The ones that strip away comfort, challenge authority, and expose the machinery behind morality, power, and identity. If this is your first time on the channel, hit subscribe and comment below which forbidden philosopher you want to discover next. Morality is a tool the weak use to control the strong. This idea, popularized by Friedrich Nietzsche, is not just a philosophical provocation, it's a fundamental challenge to the moral framework most societies are built on. To understand it, one must first separate morality from goodness. Morality, in this context, is not an innate compass of what is right or wrong. It is a social construction designed and propagated to serve a specific purpose. And that purpose, Nietzsche argues, is control. In every civilization, there have been power dynamics: those who hold strength, wealth, intelligence, or charisma, and those who do not. According to Nietzsche, early societies were dominated by what he called master morality, a system born from the instincts of the powerful. In this framework, what was considered good was synonymous with strength, nobility, vitality, and power. Bad, conversely, was associated with weakness, cowardice, or anything that could not assert itself. But over time, the tables turned. The majority, those without strength, developed a counter-morality, what Nietzsche called slave morality. This system redefined the values. Now, weakness became a virtue. Obedience became righteousness. Meekness became holiness. The strong were rebranded as cruel, oppressive, sinful. This reversal of values wasn't accidental. It was strategic. The weak, unable to rise through direct confrontation, used morality as a psychological weapon. Through guilt, shame, and moral pressure, they could exert power over those who would otherwise dominate them. They created stories of divine justice, afterlives, sins, and moral debts. In doing so, they tamed the powerful, not with swords, but with ideas. This wasn't just about fairness, it was a form of social engineering. Consider how often morality has been used throughout history, not to elevate virtue, but to suppress rebellion. The hero who disobeys, who conquers, who lives by his own rules, is often labeled evil or dangerous. Saints are praised for suffering, for turning the other cheek, for dying quietly rather than fighting back. Why? Because such narratives keep the status quo intact. A moral system that punishes strength and rewards submission keeps the powerful in chains and the weak in moral authority. Even religion, Nietzsche argued, became a vessel for this dynamic. Christianity, in his view, glorified poverty, humility, and self-denial, while condemning pride, ambition, and instinct. This, he claimed, was not because these traits were inherently bad, but because they threatened the existing power structure maintained by the weak majority. Religion offered the masses a sense of superiority, not through action or achievement, but through moral comparison. You may be rich, but I am righteous. You may be free, but I am pure. This doesn't mean that all morality is false, but it does mean that we must question where our moral beliefs come from and who they serve. Are we living by principles that elevate life or ones that restrict it? Are our values chosen or inherited? Do they empower us or do they make us feel noble for staying small? In Nietzsche's eyes, the truly free individual is the one who sees this mechanism and breaks it. He calls this person the Übermensch, the one who creates his own values, who rises above inherited guilt and lives not in reaction to others' expectations, but by the fire of his own becoming. Freedom is an illusion designed to make obedience feel like a choice. This idea sits at the heart of Michel Foucault's critique of modern society. Unlike traditional systems of overt domination, like monarchies or slave economies, modern power operates subtly, insidiously. It no longer forces bodies into chains. It shapes minds to wear them willingly. And that's the terrifying brilliance of the illusion called freedom. In ancient regimes, power was visible. Kings issued decrees, guards held swords. Disobedience brought punishment, exile, or death. You knew who ruled you. But in modern democracies, the language shifts. We are told we are free, free to choose, to express, to vote, to live as we wish. Yet, despite all these freedoms, most people behave exactly as the system wants. They work long hours, obey laws they didn't write, adopt beliefs they didn't invent, and consume products they were manipulated into desiring. Foucault described this as disciplinary power. It's not enforced by a tyrant. It's embedded in institutions, schools, hospitals, prisons, corporations. From a young age, we are trained to internalize expectations. Grades in school don't just assess knowledge, they teach conformity. Corporate hierarchies don't just manage productivity, they train submission. Surveillance isn't always cameras and guards. It's the constant awareness that we are being watched, judged, measured. So we adjust ourselves. We self-police, and we call it freedom. The power of this illusion lies in its framing. If people believe they are choosing, they stop resisting. If workers believe their job is a personal choice, even if they are trapped by economic necessity, they won't rebel. If citizens believe they are free because they can vote, though every option serves the same machine, they won't question the system. The illusion of choice pacifies dissent. It transforms obedience into identity. It makes slavery feel like autonomy. Even our desires are programmed. Media doesn't just entertain, it manufactures consent. Algorithms don't just recommend, they condition taste. The market doesn't just reflect wants, it creates them. The modern subject is told, be yourself, while being surrounded by invisible forces scripting who that self should be. You wear what's trending, you speak in hashtags, you chase validation through likes. And all the while, you think you're free. This is what Foucault called the panopticon effect. Inspired by a prison design where inmates never know when they're being watched, modern society makes each person a warden of their own behavior. You monitor yourself, you regulate your thoughts, you modify your speech. Not because someone told you to, but because you think it's who you are. That's how power wins. It hides behind the mirror. So when freedom is preached, it must be examined. What are you free from? What are you free for? Are you free to question the very framework of your existence, or only to select between pre-approved alternatives? True freedom isn't choosing between Pepsi and Coke. It's recognizing the factory that built both and deciding whether you want to drink at all. To believe in freedom without interrogating its design is to mistake the cage for the sky. And once obedience feels like a choice, resistance becomes heresy. Pity is disguised contempt. This idea, raw, unsettling, and rarely admitted, can be traced through the writings of both Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. On the surface, pity seems like a noble emotion, a sign of compassion, kindness, or moral superiority. But under closer scrutiny, it reveals something darker, a subtle power play that positions the pitier above the pitied. To pity someone is to assume their inferiority, to affirm their weakness, and to declare yourself as the more fortunate, capable, or enlightened party. Nietzsche viewed pity as a corrupting force, not a virtue. He saw it as an emotion that devalues life by fixating on its most broken elements. When people pity others, they are not lifting them up. They are reinforcing the idea that suffering is noble, that weakness deserves reverence, and that strength should humble itself before it. This, Nietzsche believed, leads to a culture of decline, where greatness is sacrificed at the altar of comfort and fragility. In his words, pity preserves what should perish. But why would someone pity another? The answer lies in status. Pity allows someone to feel superior while pretending to be kind. It's a mask worn by power. To say, "I pity you," is not simply to acknowledge suffering, it's to declare yourself as the one not suffering, the one above, the one who can afford to extend emotional charity. It's a performance of goodness that depends on someone else's misfortune. And in that performance, the pitied person is reduced, stripped of agency, turned into an object of someone else's moral theater. This becomes especially evident in acts of public charity or media narratives. The poor are pitied, but rarely empowered. The sick are pitied, but rarely treated as equals. Pity creates a spectacle, a moment where the observer can feel righteous by gazing down at someone else's fall. There's no genuine desire for transformation, just a sentimental affirmation of one's own virtue. It says, "I see your suffering, but from a distance, where I'm safe, strong, and untouched." Schopenhauer, though more sympathetic to human suffering, also recognized the dangers of pity. He believed that compassion must come from identification, not separation. True compassion arises when we recognize our shared nature with others, not when we place ourselves above them. Pity, by contrast, maintains distance. It turns the other person into a symbol of tragedy rather than a full, complex being. It whispers, "You are broken, and I am not." This dynamic is especially dangerous in personal relationships. Pity can masquerade as love, but it's rooted in imbalance. When someone stays with a partner out of pity, they're no longer relating as equals. They are caretaking, managing, tolerating, not loving. The relationship becomes hollow, built not on mutual respect, but on silent superiority. Pity is not always malicious, but it is always hierarchical. It requires someone to be beneath, and that's where the contempt lies, hidden, unspoken, but deeply felt. It's the contempt of thinking someone is incapable, unfixable, or too damaged to rise. It's the contempt of seeing another person not as a mirror, but as a moral project. And it's this disguised contempt that makes pity so dangerous, because it feels righteous, even as it silently condemns. God is not dead because he never existed. This statement is not simply a denial of faith. It is a rejection of the very framework upon which centuries of meaning, morality, and authority have been constructed. To say God is dead, as Nietzsche famously did, was not merely an attack on religion, but a diagnosis of cultural collapse. But to go further, to say God never existed, is to strip away the illusion completely. It is to assert that what we called God was a projection, a mirror held up to our fears, a concept forged not from revelation, but from need. For millennia, God functioned as the ultimate explanation. Where knowledge ended, God began. Storms, disease, death, the stars. God was the answer to every mystery, the cause behind every effect. But as science advanced, as reason matured, the divine gaps grew smaller. God became less necessary. Yet he lingered not because of logic, but because of longing. God was not just an answer. He was a structure, a psychological crutch, a cosmic father figure watching over a frightened species that feared meaninglessness more than death. The idea that God never existed is not merely atheistic. It is psychological and sociological. Humans created gods in their image, not the other way around. Ancient tribes gave names and personalities to forces they couldn't control. Fertility gods, war gods, sky gods, all embodied human concerns. Over time, these deities were refined, centralized, elevated. Eventually, one god rose above the rest, monotheistic, omnipotent, and absolute. But the root was the same: projection. God was a response to terror, a coping mechanism against chaos. The philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach argued that theology is anthropology in disguise, that when people describe God as wise, just, or loving, they are merely elevating human traits to divine heights. God becomes the idealized version of ourselves. We pray to our own image, inflated to cosmic proportions. Nietzsche took this further. He declared that by clinging to God, we deny life. We worship weakness, humility, and suffering because we've been told they are holy. Religion, he argued, glorifies decay and calls it virtue. The consequences of this illusion are immense. Morality rooted in God becomes unquestionable. Power claimed in God's name becomes righteous. Wars, punishments, and cultural norms become sacred, not because they are just, but because they are divinely ordained. If God never existed, then all of this, Scripture, commandments, sin, salvation, is man-made. It means there is no objective meaning, only interpretations. No divine justice, only human law. No afterlife, only legacy or oblivion. This realization is terrifying to many. The thought that no one is watching, no one is planning, and no one will reward or punish, that existence is indifferent, is enough to drive people back into the arms of belief. But for Nietzsche, this was the ultimate test. Without God, humans must create their own values. They must bear the burden of freedom. They must become the source of meaning rather than the subject of it. To say God never existed is not to mock belief, it is to expose its roots. It is to peel back the layers of myth and ritual and see the trembling human behind the mask, desperate for order in a chaotic world. It is to take responsibility for life without appealing to a skyward authority. And in that radical absence, some will find despair, but others will find the terrifying power of freedom. Education is a system of disciplined ignorance. This phrase may sound paradoxical, even offensive to those who revere schooling as the foundation of progress. But when examined through the lens of critical philosophy, it reveals a disturbing truth. Formal education often functions less as a tool for liberation and more as a mechanism for conformity. What is taught is not always truth, it is what society permits. And what is omitted is often more revealing than what is included. Education, in its ideal form, should awaken minds, encourage questioning, and ignite creativity. But in practice, especially in state-run systems, it frequently does the opposite. It standardizes thinking, rewards obedience, and punishes deviation. Children are taught not how to think, but what to think, according to pre-approved scripts. The curriculum is not designed to foster independent judgment, but to produce citizens who can function smoothly within a pre-existing economic and political structure. Michel Foucault, a harsh critic of institutions, argued that schools are one of many disciplinary structures in society, alongside prisons, factories, and hospitals. In schools, bodies are organized by bells, confined to desks, drilled in routines, and evaluated through metrics. This discipline trains not just behavior, but thought. By rewarding compliance and penalizing curiosity that doesn't align with the lesson plan, schools produce minds that conform long before they rebel. Consider the subjects that are emphasized: mathematics, grammar, basic science, national history. These are useful skills, but also safe ones. Rarely are students encouraged to deeply question capitalism, the morality of war, the psychological effects of media, or the philosophical basis of law. These subjects are reserved for advanced study, if addressed at all. Why? Because critical thought is dangerous. A mind that questions the system becomes harder to manage. The ignorance within education is not the absence of facts. It's the curation of facts to maintain ideological control. Students may learn the dates of wars, but not the corporations that profited from them. They may study government structures, but not the mechanisms of systemic corruption. They may read literature, but only within a sanitized framework. Even history is taught not as complexity, but as a nationalist myth, a sequence of glorified victories and righteous causes. What's more insidious is how students internalize this process. After years of being rewarded for memorizing and repeating, many lose the desire to question at all. They mistake credentials for intelligence, authority for truth, and repetition for understanding. They become efficient at solving problems that others define, but paralyzed when asked to define their own. The system's true brilliance lies in its subtlety. It convinces individuals that they are being educated while quietly narrowing their intellectual horizons. They emerge with diplomas, trained to operate machines, fill spreadsheets, and follow policies, but unable to challenge the world that shaped them. They know how to follow instructions, but not how to rewrite them. This is disciplined ignorance, the art of molding minds so they remain unaware of their chains. The appearance of learning without the substance of wisdom. The illusion of freedom within walls carefully constructed to shape thought, limit imagination, and ensure that those in power remain unchallenged. Most people don't live, they're merely lived through by systems. This statement strikes at the core of modern existence. It suggests that what we call living is often little more than performing routines prescribed by unseen structures. From birth to death, most individuals follow a script written long before they arrived, by governments, economies, religions, corporations, and institutions. These systems shape values, define success, dictate schedules, and even engineer desires. The individual, far from being the author of their life, becomes a vessel, a node plugged into a matrix of expectations, surveillance, and consumption. Consider the structure of an average life. A child is born and almost immediately categorized by nationality, class, race, religion. They are assigned an identity that they did not choose. They are entered into a school system that measures their worth with standardized tests and conditions their behavior with rewards and punishments. From there, they are funneled into a job market that expects them to trade their time for money, often in roles that offer little meaning beyond economic survival. This is not accidental, it is systemic. Systems need predictability. Governments need obedience. Markets need consumers. Corporations need labor. And so, from every direction, individuals are molded to meet those needs. The illusion of choice is maintained through superficial freedoms, the freedom to pick a major, to choose a job, to buy a certain brand. But the deeper structures, the frameworks of time, value, work, and identity, remain untouched. Most people don't question why they work 40 hours a week, why they retire at 65, why they consume news from approved sources, or why their lives feel like a treadmill they didn't design. Foucault's concept of biopower is relevant here. It describes the way modern systems exert control not just over behavior, but over life itself, regulating bodies, managing health, determining birth and death through policies and procedures. The self becomes a managed entity, subject to optimization, productivity, and constant surveillance. Even leisure becomes colonized. Algorithms suggest what to watch. Ads suggest what to buy. Social media scripts how to express joy, grief, anger, or love. The result is a life where spontaneity is rare and originality is mistaken for rebellion. Most people speak in recycled language, dream in borrowed imagery, and work toward goals that aren't their own. They inherit beliefs, adopt lifestyles, and perform roles, but never ask, whose story am I really living? Even spirituality is often commodified. Meditation apps, wellness trends, life coaching, they offer moments of relief without addressing the larger machinery, draining life of its authenticity. The self becomes a brand, the soul becomes content, and living becomes a performance staged for metrics and validation. This is what it means to be lived through by systems. It is to exist within a world that uses your life to perpetuate its own existence. Your energy, time, emotions, they are harvested to keep the system running. And unless there is awareness, unless there is a rupture in the script, you do not live. You are lived. You are carried along by forces that never asked who you are or what you want, only how useful you can be to the machine. Happiness is a fleeting drug for the docile. This statement confronts a central tenet of modern life, the obsessive pursuit of happiness. We are told from every angle that happiness is the goal, the reward for good behavior, the mark of a successful life, the proof that all our sacrifices were worth it. But beneath the polished smiles and motivational quotes lies a harsher truth. Happiness, as it is packaged and sold, often functions more as a sedative than a form of liberation. It is a tool used to pacify, to distract, and to keep individuals content within systems that exploit them. In consumer societies, happiness has been commercialized into a product. It's available in pills, vacations, luxury goods, and self-help books. It's marketed as something just out of reach, yet always attainable if you just buy the right thing or adopt the right mindset. This creates a loop. People chase fleeting highs, confuse comfort with meaning, and remain docile because they believe they're almost there. The promise of happiness becomes a leash. Corporations and governments alike benefit from this engineered pursuit. A happy population is less likely to revolt, less likely to question authority, less likely to ask difficult questions about exploitation, inequality, or the deeper purpose of life. If people can be convinced that their discomfort is merely a personal failure, not a systemic condition, they will blame themselves rather than the structures they live under. In this sense, happiness becomes a form of control, a brief emotional reward offered in exchange for obedience. Philosophers like Schopenhauer viewed happiness with suspicion. He argued that it was not a true state, but a temporary relief from suffering. Life, he believed, is primarily driven by desire and lack. When one desire is fulfilled, another arises. What we call happiness is merely the brief silence between cravings. It is not a foundation, it is an intermission. To structure life around its pursuit is to chase shadows. Nietzsche, too, distrusted the cult of happiness. He believed that greatness requires suffering, struggle, and conflict. The pursuit of comfort dulls the will. It makes people fragile, docile. In his view, those obsessed with happiness rarely achieve anything of worth because they avoid the pain that transformation demands. True power, Nietzsche believed, comes not from seeking pleasure, but from embracing difficulty. This is why modern happiness often feels hollow. It is tailored to avoid discomfort. It discourages introspection. It rewards surface-level contentment over depth. People are told to be grateful, to think positive, to smile more. But these mantras often conceal a deeper despair. They create a culture where emotional pain is pathologized, where dissatisfaction is seen as a personal defect, and where silence is demanded from those who suffer. The docility comes from the belief that happiness is proof of moral correctness, that if you're happy, you must be doing something right. This discourages dissent. It teaches people to smile through injustice, to swallow dissatisfaction, to normalize the abnormal. It's not that happiness itself is bad, but the way it's weaponized, the way it's used to suppress unrest and maintain compliance, makes it deeply suspicious. In this light, happiness is not liberation. It is not truth. It is a drug carefully administered in measured doses to keep the machine running smoothly, to make people love their comfort more than their freedom, to dull the edge of their questions and keep them soft, smiling, and silent. Love is a biological trap to ensure reproduction. This unsettling idea reframes one of humanity's most cherished emotions as little more than a genetic mechanism. It challenges the romantic narratives that permeate literature, religion, film, and personal identity. While love is often described in transcendent poetic terms, soulmate, divine connection, eternal bond, evolutionary biology suggests a far colder foundation. Love, at its core, may not be about spiritual union or emotional fulfillment. It may simply be nature's most effective strategy to ensure that the human species survives. From a biological standpoint, the purpose of life is survival and replication. Every living organism is an agent of its DNA, driven to pass on its genetic material. In species with complex social structures like humans, brute mating strategies are insufficient. To ensure offspring survive to maturity, nature had to create a system that bonded two individuals long enough to care for a child. Enter love, an emotional illusion that binds parents together, creates intense pleasure through attachment, and masks the underlying reproductive function with poetry and sentimentality. Neurochemically, love is orchestrated by a cocktail of hormones and neurotransmitters: dopamine for attraction and pleasure, oxytocin for bonding, vasopressin for long-term attachment. These chemicals reward closeness, reinforce connection, and create a craving for intimacy. They operate like a drug, triggering highs, withdrawals, and sometimes obsession. But unlike drugs, which are recreational, these chemicals are nature's way of programming reproductive behavior into the nervous system. What we interpret as meaning or destiny may simply be molecular necessity. Romantic love, particularly, tends to erupt with intensity and urgency. This is ideal from an evolutionary perspective. It accelerates pair bonding and sexual activity. Once the bond is established and the possibility of conception is high, the euphoric stage often fades. The initial passion is not designed to last. It's meant to be intense enough to initiate the process. The long-term phase, so-called companionate love, ensures child-rearing stability, but it lacks the thrill of the beginning. This natural progression often leaves people confused, believing something is wrong with their relationship, when, in fact, they are simply following a biological script. The idea that love is a trap doesn't mean it is meaningless, but it does mean that its meaning is not what we think it is. The pain of heartbreak, for instance, serves a reproductive function too. Emotional devastation following a breakup is a signal of loss, of a partner, of a reproductive ally, of social stability. The evolutionary cost of lost love is high, so the emotional penalty is severe. This ensures individuals are less likely to abandon a bond easily. Even jealousy, often seen as toxic, has evolutionary roots. It protects the pair bond from external threats. It ensures fidelity. It minimizes the risk of raising a child that carries another man's genes. In this context, love becomes a system of incentives and penalties to maintain reproductive success. So while we dress love in vows, songs, and spiritual metaphors, biology operates beneath the surface. It doesn't care about romance. It doesn't care about personal growth. It cares only about replication. And the most efficient way to replicate a species as emotionally complex as ours is to wrap the primal need for reproduction in an emotional dream called love. Your values are inherited, not chosen. This statement challenges the modern belief in personal autonomy. We like to think our morals, preferences, and convictions are the result of conscious choice, that we weigh ideas, reflect, and arrive at principles that define who we are. But most of the time, the foundation of our values was laid before we could speak. They were absorbed, not selected, transmitted through language, culture, religion, media, and family long before we had the tools to question them. At birth, a child is a blank slate in terms of worldview. Within moments, the process of value transmission begins. If the child is born into a religious household, they are exposed to rituals, stories, and rules that feel sacred. If raised in a military household, the child likely absorbs values of discipline, loyalty, and honor. If the family emphasizes education, work ethic, or community, those frameworks become default settings for interpreting reality. The child doesn't choose these starting points, they inherit them. Language itself is a vehicle for value transmission. Words like good, bad, success, and failure carry cultural weight. A child hears applause when they obey and correction when they defy. These emotional responses form associations between behavior and worth. Over time, the child comes to believe that what earns praise is right and what earns scorn is wrong. But these definitions are arbitrary, shaped by the specific microcosm they inhabit. A behavior celebrated in one culture might be condemned in another. This is why values feel so deeply personal, even when they aren't. They're internalized through repetition and reinforcement. Media plays a role, too. Movies, songs, and stories model heroes and villains, teaching what is noble, shameful, or desirable. Schools extend this process, reinforcing national history, civic duty, and social order. Eventually, the individual mistakes absorption for authorship. They say, "This is what I believe," without recognizing they were never given a genuine alternative. Even rebellion is often derivative. A teenager who opposes their parents' values may simply adopt the values of their peer group, subculture, or digital echo chamber. The illusion of choice remains, but the mechanism is the same: inheritance through influence. What's marketed as independent thought is often the product of a different authority. This inheritance extends beyond culture into morality. Concepts like justice, fairness, loyalty, or respect are not universal. They're contextual. A person raised in a collectivist culture will value harmony and duty, while someone raised in an individualist culture may prize autonomy and self-expression. These aren't objective truths. They are frameworks passed down like furniture, worn into the architecture of the mind. Philosophers like Nietzsche warned that many so-called values are survival tactics of the past, no longer relevant but still worshipped out of habit. He called for a revaluation of all values, an unflinching examination of inherited beliefs. But few ever reach this level of scrutiny. To do so requires dismantling the foundation of one's identity, an act both terrifying and liberating. In reality, most people live within values that were given to them, not forged. They dress them in the language of choice, but beneath the surface, they are echoes of past generations, silent guides shaping decisions, allegiances, and even the definition of a meaningful life. Sanity is defined by the majority, often by the most mediocre. This concept reveals a disturbing truth about how society regulates thought and behavior. Sanity, as commonly understood, is not a universal standard based on truth or health. It is a consensus, a social agreement. And like all consensus, it is vulnerable to the influence of those who hold power, not necessarily those who hold wisdom. When the majority defines what is normal, those who deviate, no matter how visionary, perceptive, or evolved, are often labeled insane. Michel Foucault devoted much of his work to this phenomenon. In Madness and Civilization, he argued that what counts as madness is not an objective category, but a socially constructed label. In different eras, different behaviors have been pathologized. Mystics, rebels, heretics, and even highly intelligent individuals who refused to conform were locked away, not because they were dangerous, but because they were disruptive. They challenged the dominant narrative of how a person should think, feel, and behave. The majority is rarely composed of geniuses or seers. It is made up of ordinary people, many of whom seek comfort in predictability and conformity. To them, anything that deviates too far from the norm appears threatening. This isn't evil, it's instinctual. Societies are built on order, and order relies on shared assumptions. But those assumptions are often shallow. When the average person determines what is sane, then sanity becomes a reflection of mediocrity. This creates a dangerous cycle. The more unique an individual is in thought or perception, the more likely they are to be seen as unstable. Visionaries are ridiculed before they are revered. Consider how often history proves this true. Galileo was labeled mad for challenging the geocentric model. Van Gogh died in obscurity, institutionalized for behavior that today might be recognized as the turmoil of genius. Even Socrates was executed for corrupting the youth with thoughts that deviated from Athens' accepted truths. Modern society is more polite, but no less controlling. Nonconformity is often diagnosed. Someone who questions authority might be deemed paranoid. Someone who refuses to follow social expectations may be considered narcissistic, delusional, or antisocial. The mental health field, while necessary and sometimes life-saving, also reflects cultural biases. What's considered disordered in one context may be celebrated in another. A mystic in India might be institutionalized in London. A dissident in a repressive regime is labeled mentally ill as a tactic of silencing. This is not to suggest that all diagnosis is false or that real mental illness does not exist. But the overlap between deviance and pathology is too consistent to ignore. Sanity, in many cases, is just the boundary of comfort for the masses. It's the perimeter drawn around acceptable thought, not to protect truth, but to preserve order. The deeper implication is that to stay sane in a mediocre society may mean dulling the mind, suppressing instinct, and pretending not to see what is plainly in front of you. Those who speak inconvenient truths are often labeled as unstable because their presence forces others to confront the fragility of the norm. And so, the average becomes the judge of the exceptional, and sanity becomes a cage built from the fears of the crowd. The crowd is always wrong. This statement is not a critique of individual people, but of collective behavior. History, psychology, and philosophy all converge on one unsettling truth. When individuals form into a group, especially a large, impassioned one, intelligence diminishes, reasoning falters, and destructive instincts rise to the surface. The crowd becomes an entity of its own, driven less by thought and more by emotion, imitation, and fear. The French philosopher Gustave Le Bon was one of the first to explore this in The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. He observed that individuals in a crowd lose their sense of responsibility and critical thinking. They become hypnotized by the collective will. The crowd thrives on simple ideas, vivid images, and emotional extremes. It does not deliberate, it reacts. It does not examine, it echoes. And once it decides something, it demands conformity, often violently. This is why the crowd has historically been the tool of tyrants. Demagogues do not rise by appealing to reason. They rise by feeding the crowd's hunger for certainty, identity, and vengeance. The crowd wants scapegoats, not nuance. It wants slogans, not philosophy. It wants to feel righteous, not to be challenged. Leaders who understand this can shape public opinion like clay, manufacturing consent through fear, repetition, and spectacle. Even democratic societies which celebrate the wisdom of the majority are vulnerable to the madness of crowds. Just because many people believe something does not make it true. Consensus can be manufactured. History is filled with moments when the majority got it disastrously wrong, when science was denied, when innocent people were condemned, when wars were cheered. The majority supported the burning of witches, the internment of minorities, the criminalization of dissent. Only in hindsight do we recognize how blind the crowd really was. Psychologically, this is explained by the phenomenon of groupthink. In groups, individuals suppress doubts to maintain harmony. They avoid voicing unpopular opinions even when they sense something is wrong. Dissent feels dangerous when the crowd is unified, so people silence themselves not because they agree, but because they fear rejection. The result is a deceptive appearance of consensus, one that leads to poor decisions, moral blindness, and historical regret. Friedrich Nietzsche saw the crowd as the enemy of greatness. To him, the herd instinct was the root of mediocrity. He believed that truth and individuality are found only by those who break away from the group, who dare to think alone, who resist the seduction of mass approval. The crowd does not produce brilliance. It crushes it. It fears the one who stands apart, because that person exposes the cowardice of collective comfort. In modern life, the crowd takes many forms: social media mobs, political rallies, financial panics, ideological tribes. Technology has amplified the voice of the crowd, but not its wisdom. Algorithms reward outrage, not insight. Virality favors the loud, not the thoughtful. And so we live in an age where being part of the crowd feels empowering, but often means surrendering discernment. To say the crowd is always wrong is to recognize that truth, courage, and clarity rarely come from the center of the noise. They come from the margins, from the outsider, the heretic, the one who walks alone. Suffering is the only authentic human experience. This claim sounds extreme, but it touches on a profound psychological and philosophical insight. That suffering, more than pleasure, comfort, or even love, exposes the raw truth of existence. It strips away illusions, dismantles ego, and brings the individual into direct contact with the reality of life. While joy can be fleeting, easily manufactured, or even faked, suffering reveals what lies beneath our performances and masks. It is the moment where pretenses fall away and something undeniable takes hold. Arthur Schopenhauer saw suffering not as a flaw in life, but as its essence. He believed that the human will, this blind, ceaseless striving force that drives existence, condemns us to a life of wanting, failing, and never being truly satisfied. Pleasure is merely the temporary absence of pain. Once a desire is fulfilled, a new desire emerges. This cycle ensures that contentment is always short-lived, but suffering remains constant. In this view, happiness is not a natural state, but a momentary exception. Suffering forces introspection. When people are comfortable, they rarely question their beliefs or values. They coast through routines, distracted by entertainment or dulled by habit. But when pain strikes, whether through loss, failure, betrayal, or mortality, it creates a rupture in the ordinary. Suddenly, all assumptions are up for examination. Who am I? Why did this happen? What does it all mean? These questions are not academic. They are born of necessity. Suffering forces the soul to speak. Religious traditions across the world acknowledge suffering as central to transformation. In Buddhism, life is defined by dukkha, often translated as suffering or dissatisfaction. It is the first noble truth, the unavoidable foundation of human experience. Only by recognizing and understanding suffering can one begin the path to awakening. In Christianity, suffering is not just inevitable, it is sacred. The suffering of Christ is central to the faith, and many saints viewed their own suffering as a means of spiritual purification. Even in secular life, suffering builds character in ways that ease never can. Resilience, empathy, courage, depth. These qualities are rarely forged in comfort. They are born in fire. The person who has endured grief understands the fragility of life. The person who has failed deeply learns humility. The one who has been rejected learns the complexity of human connection. These lessons are not taught. They are lived. In art and literature, suffering is the source of the deepest expression. The most powerful poems, paintings, and songs are often rooted in pain. Beauty born from struggle resonates because it feels real. Joy, when expressed without the shadow of suffering, often feels hollow. But when joy arises in spite of suffering, or after it, it becomes profound. It feels earned. Suffering also breaks down the illusion of separation. In pain, people see their shared vulnerability. It levels the playing field, reminding everyone of their mortality, their longing, their fears. It is the great equalizer, the reminder that no matter our status or beliefs, we all bleed, grieve, and die. To deny suffering is to deny a fundamental part of being human. It is not something to be avoided at all costs, but something to be understood, endured, and even, at times, embraced. Because in suffering, life ceases to be a performance and becomes something real. Truth is not discovered, it is manufactured by power. This claim overturns the traditional belief that truth is an objective reality waiting to be found by rational minds. Instead, it suggests that what societies call truth is not eternal, neutral, or universal, but constructed, produced by those who hold power. It is not so much revealed as it is curated, enforced, and normalized. The implications are enormous. It means that truth is not about what is, but about who gets to decide what counts as real, right, and acceptable. Michel Foucault, who explored this idea in depth, argued that every society has what he called a regime of truth, a set of statements, assumptions, and accepted facts that define the boundaries of reality at a given time. These truths are not dictated by nature or divinity, but by institutions, schools, courts, media, scientific bodies, religious authorities. These institutions don't simply reflect truth, they produce it. They decide what can be said, who's allowed to speak, and which narratives will be promoted or silenced. Consider history. The version taught in schools is not the whole story. It is a selection. It emphasizes certain heroes, events, and causes, while omitting others. It simplifies, glorifies, and often distorts. Why? Because the purpose of historical truth is not just education, it is national identity, loyalty, and social cohesion. The dominant version of the past serves the interests of the present ruling structure. In this sense, truth is political. Science, often considered the most objective domain, is not exempt. Scientific truth is shaped by funding, institutional priorities, and paradigms. For decades, scientists endorsed eugenics, not because it was true, but because it aligned with the values of power structures in that era. Pharmaceutical research, environmental data, and nutritional science are all vulnerable to manipulation, not by rogue individuals, but by systemic incentives. What is studied, published, and accepted is influenced by who controls the narrative. Even language itself is a technology of power. The words we use define what can be thought. Concepts like terrorist, criminal, or insane carry not just descriptive weight, but political consequences. Labeling someone as dangerous, unwell, or immoral can justify surveillance, punishment, or exclusion. These labels appear objective, but they are decisions made by courts, psychiatrists, media outlets, backed by authority, not nature. Foucault emphasized that power does not merely repress, it produces. It produces knowledge, institutions, disciplines, and identities. The student, the patient, the citizen, all are constructed through systems of classification and control. Truth, then, is not outside these systems. It is their product. This doesn't mean there is no reality, but the way that reality is interpreted, framed, and disseminated is never neutral. It always reflects an agenda. Truth is what power needs it to be at any given moment, and those who challenge it are often labeled as mad, dangerous, or conspiratorial, not because they are wrong, but because they disrupt the structure that truth sustains. To understand this is to see the world differently, not as a landscape of facts waiting to be uncovered, but as a battlefield of narratives where truth is the prize and power is the author. Faith is cowardice dressed as hope. This statement challenges the revered position faith holds in nearly every culture. Faith is commonly celebrated as virtuous, even heroic, a bold leap into the unknown, a trusting surrender in the face of uncertainty. But when examined critically, faith can often be a mask, a mental retreat not from chaos, but from the responsibility of confronting it. It becomes a way to outsource discomfort, to deny the burden of reason, and to replace clarity with emotional anesthesia. In this light, faith may not be hope at all. It may be fear rebranded as virtue. To have faith is, by definition, to believe without evidence. This suspension of critical thought is often defended as necessary when dealing with things beyond human comprehension: God, destiny, the afterlife, or the ultimate meaning of life. But the question arises, why must belief arise in the absence of evidence? Why is the very lack of proof so often considered a strength? Because it relieves the believer of accountability. It allows them to cling to comforting ideas without engaging in the difficult work of uncertainty, doubt, or inquiry. In this way, faith can become an escape, a carefully constructed fortress that protects the individual from the discomfort of intellectual freedom. Nietzsche condemned this tendency fiercely. He saw faith, particularly religious faith, as a symptom of weakness. To him, it was the last refuge of those unable to face the raw chaos of existence. Faith was not the courageous act it claimed to be. It was the trembling submission of those who needed to believe that life must have order, must have justice, must have a purpose. In other words, faith was less about bravery and more about fear, fear of randomness, fear of mortality, fear of meaninglessness. Hope, in contrast, does not require blindness. True hope can coexist with uncertainty. It does not demand the sacrifice of intellect. It allows for possibility without pretending to possess certainty. Faith, however, often insists on certainty where none exists. It claims to know what cannot be known, and in doing so, it shuts down curiosity. It replaces exploration with doctrine. In politics, too, faith often functions as cowardice. Citizens are told to have faith in their leaders, in their systems, in the process. This becomes a substitute for scrutiny. Instead of asking hard questions or demanding transparency, many defer to faith, believing, without evidence, that things will work out. This faith numbs resistance. It transforms the public into passive spectators rather than active participants. This doesn't mean that all faith is inherently cowardly, but it does mean that much of what passes for faith is a refusal to engage with discomfort. It's easier to say, have faith, than to admit, I don't know. It's easier to hope that someone or something will save us than to recognize that no one is coming. And it's easier to rest in faith than to move through fear. True courage lies not in faith, but in confronting the unknown without pretense, acknowledging the darkness without needing to dress it in heavenly light. Because when faith becomes a shield against thinking, it ceases to be noble. It becomes a beautifully disguised fear. You are not free. You're a well-behaved prisoner. This statement doesn't deny that modern societies offer the illusion of freedom. It reveals that the structures surrounding that illusion are designed to keep people obedient while making them believe they're autonomous. You are told you can choose your job, your clothes, your partner, and your politicians. But these choices exist within invisible walls, walls made of laws, customs, technologies, algorithms, debts, and expectations. The fact that you don't see the bars doesn't mean they aren't there. Michel Foucault explored this deeply through the concept of disciplinary societies. He argued that modern power doesn't need to operate through violence or public punishment like it did in ancient times. It now works through normalization, through routines, schedules, exams, surveillance, and constant measurement. You're not forced to comply. You're trained to desire it. Schools teach punctuality, obedience, and standardized thinking. Workplaces reinforce hierarchy, repetition, and time discipline. Social media enforces performative identity. Everywhere, systems are quietly shaping how you think, behave, and even feel. The well-behaved part of the prisoner is essential. Unlike the prisoner who resists, who kicks against the bars, the modern individual often polices themselves. You wake up on time, clock in, produce, consume, and monitor your own behavior as if someone were always watching, because they often are. You edit your language to avoid offense. You curate your thoughts to stay acceptable. You seek approval, likes, validation, and status within pre-approved boundaries. This is not freedom. This is voluntary confinement disguised as dignity. Freedom, in its true sense, would involve the capacity to define your own values, create your own structure, and step outside the systems that claim ownership over your time and attention. But for most, that is unthinkable. Even leisure is programmed. You rest when the calendar permits. You vacation according to societal rhythms. You even meditate or practice mindfulness through apps that track your progress like a productivity report. The prison, in this case, is efficient. It runs on consent. Debt is another form of invisible captivity. Students begin adulthood shackled by loans. Workers are bound to wages because their expenses were designed to keep them dependent. Home ownership becomes a 30-year sentence. Retirement becomes the distant carrot that justifies decades of submission. You call it a career path, but it is often a maze designed to prevent escape. The bars are financial, the warden is economic anxiety, and the sentence is lifelong. Even identity is shaped by the prison. You are encouraged to define yourself, but only through categories that already exist: race, gender, nationality, profession, political tribe. These identities come with scripts and expected behaviors. Step outside those, and you risk being labeled dangerous, deviant, or delusional. Conformity is rewarded with praise and visibility. Rebellion is punished with ridicule or erasure. You perform freedom within a pre-approved role. The brilliance of this system is that it doesn't need walls or chains. It trains you to love your cell. It teaches you to decorate it with success and call it fulfillment. You wear the uniform not because it was forced on you, but because you were told it was fashionable. You are not free. You're just a model prisoner with perfect attendance. Compassion can be a weakness that breeds more suffering. This statement unsettles the common moral intuition that compassion is always virtuous, always healing. We are taught to be compassionate, to feel for others, to alleviate their pain, to put ourselves in their place. But compassion, when left unexamined or unchecked, can become a force that prolongs dysfunction, rewards dependency, and inadvertently deepens the very suffering it seeks to relieve. Nietzsche viewed compassion with suspicion. He saw it as a moral ideal, promoted not by the strong, but by the weak, those who wanted to equalize the playing field by glorifying suffering rather than overcoming it. In this framework, compassion isn't strength, it's a mechanism of guilt. It invites the capable to lower themselves instead of lifting others up. It turns strength into sin and weakness into a virtue. Over time, this inversion doesn't elevate the weak, it paralyzes the strong. Consider how compassion operates in personal relationships. A parent who constantly protects their child from struggle may think they're being kind, but they may be raising an adult incapable of resilience. Shielding someone from pain doesn't eliminate it, it often just delays it. When compassion overrides wisdom, it infantilizes. It says, "I will carry your burden for you, even when the burden is necessary for growth." The result is a cycle of dependence where the compassionate person becomes the rescuer and the one receiving it becomes passive, incapable of facing life without help. In the realm of social policy, compassion can become a system of chronic enabling. Welfare systems that offer assistance without accountability may relieve immediate distress, but also risk creating generational dependency. Compassion, in this case, can become institutionalized indulgence, a way of keeping people comfortable in their suffering rather than empowering them to rise above it. The intention is noble, but the long-term outcome can be dehumanizing. In relationships, compassion can be weaponized. Manipulative individuals learn to exploit it, using their pain as currency. They provoke guilt to avoid accountability. They collapse every criticism into, "You don't understand what I've been through," knowing that compassion often silences confrontation. In these cases, compassion isn't kindness, it's emotional blackmail. The more one gives, the more they are controlled. The result is mutual suffering, one trapped by guilt, the other by a refusal to change. There is also a darker consequence. Compassion, when indiscriminately applied, can blur moral boundaries. Feeling sorry for everyone, regardless of their choices or intentions, can erode justice. When compassion is extended to those who harm, exploit, or destroy without any expectation of responsibility or change, it undermines fairness. It begins to sympathize with the wolf while ignoring the sheep. This distortion can lead to dangerous tolerance, where the line between empathy and appeasement vanishes. True compassion is not weakness, it's discerning. It knows when to help and when to let go. It asks not only how to alleviate pain, but whether that pain is necessary for transformation. Without this discernment, compassion becomes a soft tyranny, the relentless attempt to protect people from the consequences of their own choices at the cost of their freedom, dignity, and evolution. When compassion loses its spine, it ceases to heal. It begins to harm. History is written by those who erased someone else's story. This idea reframes our understanding of the past. It suggests that history, far from being an objective record of events, is a curated narrative, assembled, revised, and polished by the victors, the rulers, the institutions, and the dominant classes. What we call history is not the full truth. It is the version that survived. It is the version that suited power. And behind every official account lies a graveyard of voices, silenced, ignored, or deliberately destroyed. The famous phrase, "History is written by the victors," only scratches the surface. Those who win not only shape the story, they often erase others entirely. Empires rewrite indigenous traditions. Colonizers rename cities. Regimes destroy archives. The truth doesn't just get bent, it gets buried. The result is not a shared memory of humanity, but a battlefield of selective remembrance. Consider how many cultures have been lost, not by natural decay, but by deliberate suppression. Indigenous histories across the Americas, Africa, and Australia were not preserved in books. They were passed orally, through rituals and song. When colonization swept through, those stories were declared primitive or pagan. Missionaries burned ceremonial objects. Schools banned native languages. Children were taught that their ancestors were savages. And so, centuries of knowledge, myth, philosophy, and wisdom were erased. Not because they lacked value, but because they challenged the colonizers' narrative of superiority. Even in literate societies, erasure is strategic. During political upheavals, the first targets are often writers, teachers, and historians. In totalitarian regimes, rewriting the past becomes a tool of control. George Orwell's 1984 famously portrayed this in the phrase, "Who controls the past controls the future." When the public's memory can be edited, they become more malleable. In Stalinist Russia, photographs were doctored to remove purged individuals. Names vanished from records. History was treated like clay, malleable in the hands of power. In the West, history often centers around white, male, European figures, not because others didn't contribute, but because those were the ones with access to publishing, education, and institutional memory. Women's contributions were minimized, reframed, or credited to men. Enslaved people's voices were excluded entirely, their lives flattened into economic statistics or anecdotal footnotes. What we learned in school was not wrong per se, it was incomplete. And deliberate omission is its own kind of lie. Modern media continues the tradition of erasure. What gets archived, broadcast, or canonized is influenced by political interests, corporate funding, and social consensus. Documentaries, museums, and textbooks still operate within curated frames. Some atrocities are remembered annually, others are forgotten overnight. Some heroes are celebrated, others are ridiculed or ignored. This selective spotlight creates the illusion of historical clarity while casting vast shadows where entire worlds once thrived. Recognizing this doesn't mean rejecting history altogether. It means questioning its authorship. It means understanding that the past is not a neutral landscape, but a power struggle. Every monument is a choice. Every textbook is a filter. And every silence in the record is often louder than the words that remain. History is not just what is remembered, it is also what is made to be forgotten. Most truths are just power talking in disguise. This statement unearths one of the most unsettling aspects of how knowledge and authority function in society. What we are taught to believe as truth is often not an objective, universal fact, but a carefully shaped narrative created and sustained by those who benefit from its acceptance. Truth in this context is not neutral. It is political. It reflects the interests of institutions, governments, ideologies, and dominant social classes. And once accepted by the public, it becomes almost invisible, camouflaged as common sense. Michel Foucault explored this concept in depth. He argued that power doesn't merely repress or silence, it produces knowledge. Institutions such as schools, media, churches, and scientific organizations don't just reflect reality, they construct it. The language they use, the subjects they prioritize, and the standards they enforce all shape what counts as truth. And when these truths become widespread, they appear natural, no longer up for debate. Take, for example, the legal system. It claims to represent justice, fairness, and truth. But whose truth is it representing? The definitions of crime, morality, and even sanity are not fixed. They are products of legal and political authority. A protester can be called a freedom fighter or a domestic threat, depending on who holds the microphone. The words may sound objective, but behind them is power deciding which version of reality gets legitimacy. The same applies to economic truths. The idea that wealth trickles down or that hard work always leads to success is often repeated as gospel. But these truths serve a purpose: to keep labor obedient, to justify inequality, and to defend systems that disproportionately benefit the elite. These are not universal facts, they are ideologies disguised as logic. The power of such truths lies in their invisibility. People accept them without realizing they are narratives constructed to uphold a structure. Even in science, the supposed bastion of objectivity, power can speak through funding, censorship, and institutional bias. Scientific research is guided by what gets financed, what gets published, and what aligns with dominant paradigms. Studies that challenge pharmaceutical profits, military technology, or state policies often struggle for visibility. Meanwhile, findings that support profitable or politically convenient conclusions are amplified. This doesn't mean science is false, but it shows that even science is vulnerable to the agenda of power. Cultural truths follow the same logic. Gender roles, beauty standards, family structures, all of these are framed as natural or traditional, but they are often the result of centuries of conditioning. These truths maintain social order, often by limiting personal freedom. They dictate how people should behave, love, speak, and exist. And when challenged, defenders of the status quo don't usually respond with data. They respond with shame, exclusion, or moral panic. The most dangerous truths are the ones that are no longer questioned. They become the air we breathe. And in that silence, power operates without resistance. When someone speaks against them, they are labeled radical, irrational, or dangerous, not because they are wrong, but because they threaten the system that truth was designed to protect. Most truths, then, are not pure reflections of reality. They are echoes of power, wearing the mask of objectivity, enforcing consensus, and preserving control. Society doesn't want thinkers, it wants repeaters. This observation reveals the uncomfortable relationship between individuality and control in modern life. While schools, governments, and corporations publicly praise creativity and critical thinking, what they reward in practice is conformity, predictability, and compliance. Thinking is dangerous. It questions. It disrupts. It sees through illusions. Repeaters, on the other hand, are safe. They memorize. They follow. They perform approved scripts with precision and never threaten the order of things. From the earliest stages of education, children are rewarded not for asking better questions, but for giving the right answers. Standardized testing doesn't measure depth of thought. It measures how well a student can absorb and regurgitate information. The curriculum is fixed, not because it represents truth, but because it aligns with cultural, political, and economic expectations. History is taught from a nationalistic angle. Science is confined to approved paradigms. Philosophy, if included at all, is diluted to avoid discomfort. Independent thought is tolerated only when it doesn't interfere with performance metrics. This pattern continues into adulthood. In the corporate world, innovation is praised until it challenges hierarchy or profitability. Workers are trained to follow systems, meet KPIs, and replicate procedures. Those who follow instructions are promoted. Those who question inefficiencies, ethics, or purpose are labeled difficult, uncooperative, or disruptive. The result is a workforce that appears functional but is intellectually anesthetized. Creativity is permitted within the narrow confines of what's profitable. Outside of that, thinking is seen as a liability. Governments follow the same logic. Democracies promote the idea of informed citizenship, but the mechanisms of politics reward oversimplification and repetition. Slogans replace nuance. Soundbites substitute for debate. Citizens are encouraged to pick a side and echo its ideology, not to think critically about either. Media reinforces this, feeding audiences curated outrage that aligns with their biases. Thought is replaced with reaction. The more one can repeat the right outrage, the more they are rewarded with likes, shares, and affirmation. Social media has accelerated this erosion of thought. Platforms are designed not to deepen reflection, but to shorten attention. Algorithms reward what spreads, not what matters. The thinker who pauses, reflects, and complicates the narrative loses visibility. The repeater who echoes the latest trend or outrage gains traction. Over time, people begin to confuse mimicry with intelligence and consensus with truth. Religions and cultural traditions also rely on repetition. Rituals, doctrines, and beliefs are passed down with the expectation of loyalty. Doubt is often discouraged or demonized. The goal is not understanding, but preservation. In many traditions, to question is to betray. This is not about spirituality. It is about maintaining order. Society doesn't need everyone to think. In fact, it functions more smoothly when most do not. It needs workers, not rebels, consumers, not philosophers, citizens, not heretics. The machine of modern civilization runs on repetition. The more predictable people are, the easier they are to govern, sell to, and control. Thinking introduces friction. It asks, why? Who benefits? What if we're wrong? And these are questions the system cannot afford to be asked too loudly or too often. So while thinkers are honored in retrospect, in the present moment, they are often inconvenient. Society celebrates them only after they're gone, when their ideas are no longer threatening, and their images can be safely used to decorate institutions that once feared them. Your desires aren't yours. They were implanted. This idea strikes at the very heart of what people believe makes them unique. We like to think our desires reflect who we are, our personalities, our goals, our authentic selves. But in reality, many of the things people want, the careers they chase, the bodies they aspire to, the lifestyles they envy, were planted in their minds long before they could reason critically. These desires are not born from introspection, but from influence, from advertising, media, tradition, and the silent pressure of culture. From birth, individuals are surrounded by suggestion. Family members teach what to admire, what to avoid, what to become. Schools reward specific ambitions and discourage others. By the time a child can articulate a dream, it has usually been shaped by thousands of external cues. I want to be a doctor may sound noble, but is it because of a personal calling, or because society equates medicine with prestige? I want to be rich may feel like an independent desire, but is it not the direct product of living in a system that equates wealth with worth? Desires are not formed in isolation. They are carefully cultivated by systems that depend on them. The global economy, for instance, thrives on dissatisfaction. It manufactures longing in order to sell solutions. Corporations spend billions studying human psychology, not to help people understand themselves, but to manipulate what people want. Commercials don't just sell products, they sell identities. A luxury watch is no longer about telling time. It's about status, success, and validation. Once the desire is implanted, the object becomes symbolic. People are no longer buying things, they're buying meaning. Social media intensifies this effect. Platforms are designed to promote envy. Users scroll through curated versions of other people's lives, absorbing subtle messages about what is beautiful, desirable, and successful. Over time, their own desires begin to mirror what they consume. They want the house, the car, the relationship, the vacation, not because it fulfills them, but because it signals belonging. Authentic yearning is replaced by performative longing. Even rebellion can be engineered. People believe they are resisting the system by adopting a countercultural identity, but often that identity is just another product. Fashion, music, slang, political views, each can be packaged and sold. The illusion of choice keeps people compliant. They believe they are choosing freely, but the menu was pre-selected long before they arrived. Religion, politics, and ideology also play their role. They frame what should be desired and what should be feared. They tell people what kind of life is virtuous, what kind of death is noble, what kind of ambition is righteous. These desires become moralized. To reject them is not just to be different, it is to be wrong. In this way, desires become tools of control, subtly guiding people into roles they never truly examined. To realize that your desires are not entirely your own is disorienting, but it is also the first step toward freedom. If a person can question where their longings came from, if they can trace the roots of their ambition, their shame, their cravings, they can begin to untangle themselves from the web of suggestion. They can start to ask, "What do I want beneath all the noise?" And most importantly, who benefits from me wanting what I want? The will to live is a curse, not a blessing. At the core of every human life is a relentless, often unconscious force, the will to live. It propels people forward, compels them to survive, reproduce, accumulate, and protect themselves. On the surface, this instinct appears as something sacred, evidence that life is precious and purposeful. But under philosophical scrutiny, the will to live reveals itself as a tyrant. It is not a gift freely accepted, but a chain people are born into. And for many, it is a source of endless suffering. Arthur Schopenhauer explored this idea with brutal clarity. He argued that the will to live is not a rational choice, but a blind, irrational drive that governs all beings. It compels without asking. It has no goal beyond continuation. People eat, sleep, seek shelter, form families, build empires, all to serve a force they never consented to. And because this will is insatiable, it ensures that peace is always temporary. Fulfill one desire, and another takes its place. Life becomes an endless cycle of need, satisfaction, boredom, and renewed craving. Pain, then, is not the exception to life. It is its constant backdrop. Hunger, fear, jealousy, loss, illness, aging, death, all stem from the simple fact that people want to continue living. Without the will to live, there would be no terror of death, no grief over loss, no existential anxiety. But because people cling to life, they suffer deeply at the thought of its end. The will to live creates the fear of dying, and with it, the ability to be emotionally tortured by time. Even pleasure, often seen as the antidote to pain, is a servant of the will. Joy is fleeting. It comes as a brief reward for temporarily satisfying the will's demands. A good meal, a moment of intimacy, a personal achievement. Each pleasure is followed by the return of need. The will does not rest. It does not allow permanent fulfillment. This is why happiness is so fragile. It depends on conditions that are constantly shifting, always vulnerable to disruption. People rarely stop to ask why they fight so hard to stay alive. Much of life is spent maintaining the body, protecting property, pursuing status, and avoiding harm. But to what end? The body decays. Possessions break or become obsolete. Status is fleeting. And in the end, death is inescapable. The will to live does not protect against death. It merely prolongs the struggle. It ensures that people are tormented by the very instinct meant to preserve them. And yet, to renounce the will to live is seen as madness. Society conditions people to see survival as sacred and suicide as a tragedy. But if living is primarily suffering, then is the instinct to survive truly noble, or is it a form of bondage? Is the will to live a sign of strength, or is it evidence of being enslaved by nature's programming? To call the will to live a curse is to recognize that it binds people to a system that offers no true escape from pain, only temporary distraction. It is not a conscious contract, but a default setting, one that keeps people endlessly chasing fulfillment in a world that can never fully deliver it. The strong create morality to serve their will. This idea flips the common belief that morality is a universal truth, independent of power, class, or interest. Instead, it suggests that moral codes are not discovered, they are designed. Designed by those with the ability to shape the values of society in ways that protect their position, justify their dominance, and legitimize their actions. Morality, in this view, is not impartial. It is a weapon dressed in virtue. Friedrich Nietzsche argued that there are two fundamental types of morality: master morality and slave morality. Master morality arises from the strong, those who are powerful, self-assured, and life-affirming. In this framework, values like strength, pride, ambition, and excellence are considered good because they reflect the traits of those who create the system. Weakness, obedience, and humility are seen as lesser, even contemptible. The strong celebrate life, assert themselves, and create their own values without apology. They do not seek permission to act. They act and then define the action as right. But this form of morality rarely lasts unchallenged. Over time, those who are weaker, numerically greater but physically or politically subordinate, begin to develop a counter-morality. This is slave morality, which values the opposite traits: meekness, submission, patience, forgiveness, and restraint. Not because these values are inherently noble, but because they give the powerless a sense of moral superiority. In this system, the strong are rebranded as evil, and the weak are elevated as good. It is a moral reversal, driven not by truth, but by resentment. This dynamic plays out in history again and again. Ruling classes enshrine their interests in religious doctrine, legal codes, and social norms. The divine right of kings, for example, was a moral justification for hereditary rule. Colonial powers described their conquest as a civilizing mission, cloaking domination in the language of virtue. Capitalist elites promote the morality of meritocracy, where wealth is seen as the natural reward for virtue rather than the outcome of structural advantages. Even within democratic societies, the moral narratives pushed by the powerful often reflect their interests. Productivity is framed as a moral duty. Poverty is moralized as laziness. Individualism is exalted, not because it is universally good, but because it supports a system where collective resistance is harder to organize. When the strong dominate not just resources, but ideas, they define what is righteous, and they do it in a way that protects their position. This doesn't mean morality is entirely fake, but it does mean that its foundations must be examined. Whose interests does a given moral system serve? Who benefits from the labeling of certain behaviors as right and others as wrong? If morality were truly universal, it would not shift so easily with power structures. But throughout history, what was once heretical becomes holy. What was once criminal becomes patriotic. And what was once evil becomes the new good. The strong do not just rule with force, they rule with stories. And the most powerful story of all is that their rule is not only effective, but moral. In shaping the moral order, they do not reflect the world as it is. They mold it to reflect themselves. Marriage is often legal slavery in disguise. This idea may seem offensive or extreme in a culture that idolizes marriage as the ultimate expression of love, trust, and commitment. But when examined through the lens of history, law, and power dynamics, marriage reveals a darker function, a contract that has often served not to liberate individuals, but to bind them, economically, emotionally, and legally, into roles they may not fully understand or ever be able to escape. Historically, marriage was never primarily about love. It was a transaction, a tool to secure alliances, transfer property, produce heirs, and consolidate power. In many cultures, women were treated as assets, given away by fathers, owned by husbands, restricted by laws that rendered them invisible as legal individuals. Their labor, sexuality, and reproduction were absorbed into the husband's household. This wasn't symbolic, it was codified. A woman's body, name, and rights were subsumed into the institution of marriage, often without recourse or autonomy. In this context, marriage was not about mutual respect, it was ownership, sanctioned by law and celebrated by society. Modern marriage has evolved in its appearance, but not always in its structure. The legal contract of marriage still comes with obligations that, once entered into, are incredibly difficult to undo without punishment. Divorce in many jurisdictions remains an expensive, emotionally draining, and stigmatized process. Financial assets are entangled, children are leveraged, and identity is fractured. People are told they are free to marry whomever they love, but once inside the institution, the freedom quickly erodes. Decisions must now be negotiated, freedom of movement often constrained, and personal desires subordinated to the marriage. Men are also subjected to these constraints, though in different ways. The expectation to provide financially, to suppress emotion, to fulfill a role of protector and authority figure. These are not acts of love, but acts of duty. Marriage tells men what kind of man they must become, and deviation from that script is punished with guilt, shame, or emotional withdrawal. The institution doesn't just bind one partner, it binds both in ways that prioritize the preservation of the union over the fulfillment of the individual. Religions and governments promote marriage not because it serves the individual, but because it serves the system. A married couple is easier to tax, to track, and to domesticate. The nuclear family becomes an economic unit, one that consumes, reproduces, and conforms. Marriage thus stabilizes society not by nurturing freedom, but by containing it. It reduces two people into a predictable legal shape, one that fits comfortably within bureaucratic categories. The state doesn't care if you're in love. It cares that you're manageable. Even emotionally, marriage can become a form of captivity. Expectations grow rigid, intimacy becomes routine, and desire is replaced by obligation. The romantic freedom people seek in marriage often becomes a cage of invisible bars: performance, guilt, sacrifice, and endurance. And yet, people continue to enter it, often without questioning what exactly they are committing to, or why. When examined honestly, marriage is less about love and more about control. Not always, but often. It transforms affection into contract, spontaneity into structure, and passion into permanence. And for many, it becomes a life sentence disguised as a dream. What you call identity is a performance for approval. This idea dismantles the comforting belief that identity is a stable, intrinsic truth about who we are. Instead, it exposes identity as a carefully constructed display, something we perform not because it reflects our core essence, but because it earns us acceptance, protection, and validation. Who people are is often shaped not by internal discovery, but by external demand. From early childhood, individuals learn that certain behaviors are rewarded and others punished. A boy who cries may be told to man up. A girl who's assertive may be labeled bossy. These micro-corrections accumulate over time, shaping how people move, speak, and even feel. This conditioning doesn't just influence behavior, it becomes identity. People internalize roles that align with societal expectations, mistaking them for who they truly are. Irving Goffman, a sociologist and the author of The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, argued that identity is a series of performances. In every context, work, family, social settings, people wear metaphorical masks. They play roles. A person may act confident in a meeting, nurturing at home, sarcastic among friends, and polite with strangers. Each version is shaped by the audience. The self, then, becomes fragmented, not unified, but adapted to survive different social demands. Social media amplifies this performance. Platforms reward visibility, but only within narrow lanes of acceptability. People curate their identities for likes and followers, exaggerating traits that fit the algorithm while hiding those that don't. Authenticity is marketed, filtered, and monetized. Vulnerability becomes content. The result is a version of selfhood that's less about expression and more about strategic appeal. People learn to brand themselves, not to explore themselves. Even rebellion is often performative. Subcultures, whether punk, goth, activist, or intellectual, develop their own codes, aesthetics, and dogmas. Joining them feels like liberation, but often it's just another script. The outsider becomes another insider somewhere else, performing a new role for a different audience. This isn't inherently bad. It's part of how social life functions, but it reveals how deeply identity is tied to the approval of others. Cultural and national identities are similarly shaped. People don't just belong to a country, they're taught how to be a good citizen. Patriotism, religion, and tradition all come with behavioral expectations. Step outside them, and you're not just different, you're a threat. These structures don't merely shape individuals, they demand allegiance. And often, identity is the price of inclusion. Even in private moments, people perform for imagined audiences. They think in terms of how they would explain themselves to others. They craft internal narratives that make sense to family, friends, or lovers. Their self-image is edited, not by honesty, but by plausibility. The question is not, who am I, but who will they think I am? This doesn't mean there is no real self, but it does mean that much of what people call me is a product of adaptation. It is not a discovery, it is a survival strategy. It is not truth, it is theater. The tragedy is not that we perform. The tragedy is that we forget we are performing and begin to believe the mask is our face. Belief in progress is a modern myth. The idea that humanity is moving steadily toward a better, more enlightened future is one of the most deeply held assumptions of the modern age. It permeates politics, science, education, and even personal development. But this belief, often presented as self-evident, is not a universal truth. It is a narrative, and like all narratives, it serves a function. The notion that history is a linear ascent toward improvement is not the result of objective observation. It is a cultural construction designed to sustain faith in institutions, technology, and the current order. In earlier civilizations, people did not believe in progress. They believed in cycles of birth and decay, rise and fall, creation and destruction. Time was circular, not linear. Ancient mythologies, including those of the Greeks, Hindus, and indigenous cultures, framed human existence within endless repetitions. Wisdom came not from the belief in novelty, but from the recognition of eternal patterns. The shift toward progress as a guiding myth emerged during the Enlightenment and gained momentum with the Industrial Revolution. Science promised mastery over nature, technology promised liberation from toil, and democratic ideals promised freedom and equality. Humanity, it was believed, was on a path upward, each generation smarter, freer, and more moral than the last. This view turned history into a staircase, with each step leading us away from ignorance and toward utopia. But history does not support such a neat trajectory. Technological advancements have brought comfort, but also new forms of dependency and alienation. The digital age has increased communication while weakening attention and intimacy. Medical breakthroughs have extended life while turning healthcare into a profit-driven maze. Every solution generates a new complexity. Progress, in this sense, does not eliminate problems. It transforms them. Political progress is equally deceptive. Wars have become more technologically advanced, but no less brutal. Empires have fallen and been replaced by new forms of control, less visible perhaps, but equally invasive. Civil rights are gained in one era and eroded in another. The notion that justice expands in a straight line ignores the cyclical backlash that often follows social gains. Progress is not a law. It is a story we tell ourselves to avoid despair. Even in personal development, the myth of progress shapes how people view themselves. The self-help industry thrives on the promise that individuals can always improve, optimize, and evolve. But this constant striving often produces anxiety, not fulfillment. It teaches people to view life as a project to be upgraded rather than an experience to be lived. Progress becomes not empowerment, but pressure. The myth of progress also obscures its beneficiaries. Economic growth, often cited as a metric of success, is not distributed evenly. The rich get richer while the poor remain trapped in systemic cycles. Technological innovation is often driven by military or corporate interests, not humanitarian ones. To believe in progress without asking who it serves is to mistake expansion for evolution. Belief in progress gives society a sense of direction, but it also blinds it to recurrence, decay, and unintended consequences. It allows people to ignore warning signs by saying, "We've come so far," even when the road ahead is unclear. Progress may exist in moments, but as a totalizing myth, it risks becoming an excuse for complacency and a disguise for stagnation. Religion was invented to ease the terror of death. At the heart of every major religious system lies a promise that death is not the end, that this life, with all its suffering, uncertainty, and impermanence, is merely a prelude to something greater. Heaven, reincarnation, resurrection, enlightenment. Each tradition offers a different version of the same assurance, that death is not final, that something, soul, consciousness, essence, continues beyond the grave. This promise is not accidental. It is the emotional foundation of religion. Long before theology was formalized, long before scripture or doctrine, there was the primal fear of ceasing to exist. Humans are the only species known to contemplate their mortality. With self-awareness comes the realization that life ends, often unpredictably, and usually without explanation. This awareness is both a curse and a catalyst. The mind, incapable of tolerating the abyss, seeks narrative. It craves meaning. And so religion emerges, not necessarily out of deception, but out of psychological necessity. It provides structure where there is none. It wraps the unknown in myth and transforms terror into hope. In ancient societies, the dead were buried with food, tools, and personal items, signs of belief in an afterlife long before formal religions existed. These early rituals weren't theological debates. They were expressions of emotional need. The thought that loved ones were simply gone was unbearable, and so stories were born, of spirits, ancestors, other worlds. Over time, these stories became systems. Oral traditions solidified into sacred texts. Shamans became priests. Rituals became institutions. But the emotional seed remained the same, a refusal to accept the void. The power of this belief is immense. If death is not the end, then suffering can be justified, sacrifice becomes noble, and injustice will eventually be corrected. Life becomes a test, a journey, a preparation. And with that framing, people are less afraid to die. They are more willing to endure, to conform, and even to kill, if they believe the divine will reward them. In this way, religion not only soothes the fear of death, it harnesses it. It turns it into fuel for obedience. This is not to say all religion is cynical or false. Many spiritual teachings offer deep wisdom, ethical insights, and profound practices for confronting mortality with grace. But the central promise that death is not real, or at least not final, remains its most universally appealing feature. Strip that away, and most religions collapse. Remove the afterlife, and the motivation for ritual, sacrifice, and moral purity weakens. The fear of death is not just part of religion, it is its spine. Modern secular societies have tried to replace religion with reason, but they struggle with the same fear. Science can explain how we die, but not what it means. Psychology can describe grief, but not resolve it. Without religion, the terror returns, naked, unmediated. This is why, even in an age of technology, belief persists. It is not logic that sustains religion, it is the desperate human need to believe that death is not the end, that somewhere, somehow, the story continues. People don't want truth, they want reassurance. This statement cuts deep into the psychology of belief and the structure of society. Despite the cultural lip service paid to truth in journalism, in education, in relationships, most people instinctively avoid it when it's uncomfortable. What they really crave is not clarity, but comfort, not revelation, but relief. They want their worldview affirmed, not challenged. Because the truth, when fully faced, is rarely convenient, rarely flattering, and almost never easy. Truth is dangerous. It threatens the fragile identities people build over years. It challenges the myths that hold society together. The myth of progress, the myth of meritocracy, the myth of personal control. To truly accept truth often requires dismantling long-held beliefs. It demands admitting that what you've invested in, politically, emotionally, spiritually, might be wrong. Most people can't tolerate that level of cognitive dissonance, so they settle for a filtered version of reality that confirms what they already believe. This is why people tend to seek out information sources that align with their biases. They don't want news, they want affirmation. They want headlines that validate their opinions, pundits who speak their language, data that supports their team. Anything else feels like betrayal or even violence. When confronted with conflicting information, many don't reconsider their views. They double down, attacking the source rather than examining the substance. Emotion overrides reason. Even in personal relationships, truth is often sacrificed for reassurance. When people ask, "Do you think I'm doing the right thing?" they're rarely looking for honest analysis. They want to hear, "Yes, you're fine, keep going." When someone asks, "Do you still love me?" they're not asking for an existential review of the relationship. They want a comforting lie if the truth is complicated. Reassurance becomes the glue of intimacy, even if it hides fractures that might one day break. In religion, this dynamic is foundational. Many faiths provide absolute answers to unanswerable questions. What happens when we die? Why is there suffering? Is there justice beyond this life? These doctrines aren't necessarily believed because they're logically sound. They're believed because they comfort. The promise of an afterlife soothes the fear of death. The idea of divine justice tempers the chaos of human cruelty. The rituals offer structure in a world of uncertainty. It's not that believers are weak, it's that being human by nature is terrifying. And reassurance is the balm that makes existence bearable. Governments and institutions know this. They don't need to provide the truth, they need to maintain public calm. In times of crisis, leaders don't tell citizens everything. They offer carefully shaped messages designed to prevent panic. "We have everything under control" becomes the default, even when they don't. The truth might provoke anger or rebellion. Reassurance maintains order. The irony is that people often claim to want truth. They demand transparency, honesty, authenticity, but only within limits. When the truth threatens their comfort, their status, or their sense of identity, they retreat. Reassurance wins, not because it's right, but because it feels good. And in a world filled with complexity, chaos, and contradiction, feeling good often matters more than being right. You were born to serve systems that pretend to serve you. From the moment of birth, every individual is inserted into a network of institutions, education, government, religion, economy, that claim to exist for their benefit. These systems offer structure, guidance, and opportunity. But beneath the surface, their primary function is not to empower, but to extract. They do not revolve around the individual revolves around them. The illusion is one of mutual benefit, but the reality is one of quiet exploitation. Take education. It is presented as a pathway to freedom, a vehicle for personal growth. In practice, it functions as a filtration mechanism. It sorts students into hierarchies, standardizes thinking, and conditions obedience. From a young age, people are trained to sit still, follow instructions, and absorb state-approved knowledge. Creativity is tolerated only when it fits the rubric. Critical thinking is encouraged only within safe boundaries. The system doesn't nurture individuality. It manufactures predictability. The economy is no different. It promises opportunity, innovation, meritocracy. But what it delivers is lifelong dependency on wages, loans, and credit. People are told to chase careers, not to question the nature of work itself. The vast majority will labor not for purpose, but for survival. They will generate profits for corporations they don't own, pay taxes to governments they can't control, and buy products to soothe the emptiness created by this cycle. The system calls it prosperity. In truth, it is servitude with branding. Even democracy, heralded as the highest form of collective self-rule, often functions as a performance. Citizens are given the vote, but only among pre-approved candidates. Policies are shaped not by the public will, but by lobbying, money, and influence. Participation is reduced to periodic rituals, elections, surveys, token protests, while real decisions are made behind closed doors. The system tells people they have power, but only within a narrow corridor. Step outside it, and the curtain falls. Social media and entertainment add another layer. They promise connection, self-expression, and joy. But they harvest attention, manipulate behavior, and monetize every interaction. The platforms pretend to serve users, giving them likes, followers, and content, but in reality, users are the product. Their time, their data, their emotions are commodities sold to advertisers and used to deepen engagement. The screen glows with freedom, but the algorithm controls the experience. Even family and cultural traditions are shaped by these systems. People are encouraged to marry, reproduce, consume, and behave in ways that reinforce the economic and political structure. The ideal citizen is a productive worker, a loyal voter, a predictable consumer, and a compliant believer. Any deviation from this path is labeled failure, rebellion, or pathology. Individuality is tolerated, but only when it serves the collective machinery. What makes these systems so powerful is that they do not rely on overt coercion. They operate through seduction. They convince people that submission is choice, that participation is empowerment. And so people serve, willingly, even gratefully. They thank the very structures that drain their time, energy, and potential. They believe they are being served, when in fact, they are the fuel keeping the system alive. Reason is a thin veil over instinct. Despite the high regard in which reason is held, especially in modern society, it is often nothing more than a refined mask placed over primal drives. Humans pride themselves on being rational creatures, capable of logic, deliberation, and objectivity. But when examined closely, reason tends to function less as an independent force and more as a tool used by deeper unconscious instincts to justify their own ends. People rarely think to find the truth. They think to defend what they already want to believe. Evolution did not shape humans to be rational. It shaped them to survive. Instinct, raw, emotional, reflexive, was the original operating system. Fight or flight, attraction, hunger, dominance, fear, tribal loyalty. These instincts are still fully intact. Reason came later, layered on top, not to replace instinct, but to manage and legitimize it. It didn't override emotion, it learned to speak its language. The result is a human mind that often makes decisions based on impulse, gut feeling, or social conditioning, and only afterward constructs a logical explanation to make it seem deliberate. Consider how people argue. Rarely are debates settled through reason alone. Most people enter a discussion not to discover truth, but to defend a position. They seek evidence that supports their views, ignore data that contradicts them, and frame their logic in ways that feel emotionally satisfying. This is confirmation bias, the tendency to favor information that aligns with pre-existing beliefs. It's not reason at work. It's instinct dressed in reason's clothing. Political behavior is another clear example. Voters like to believe their choices are based on careful thought and moral clarity. In reality, many vote based on identity, fear, tradition, or tribal affiliation. They respond to symbols, tone, and emotional cues more than policy detail. Reason is used to justify allegiance, not form it. Politicians and marketers know this. They appeal to instinct first, security, pride, resentment, and reason second. They don't sell ideas. They sell feelings, then provide rational talking points as cover. Even in personal relationships, reason bows to instinct. People often fall in love, trust, forgive, or abandon based on emotional impulse. They then construct narratives to justify what they already feel. They say, "I had no choice," or it just felt right, or something didn't sit well with me, relying on intuition first and logic later. Instinct whispers and reason drafts the email. Religion, ideology, and morality also follow this pattern. The rules people follow often stem from cultural imprinting, fear of exclusion, or deep psychological need. Logic comes afterward, retrofitting rational frameworks around emotional truths. People believe what helps them feel safe, connected, or purposeful. Then theologians, philosophers, or influencers provide the intellectual scaffolding to support the belief. This doesn't mean reason is meaningless. It can clarify, challenge, and elevate. But it is far more fragile than we like to admit. It is a tool, not a foundation, a reflection of deeper drives, not their commander. And unless people recognize the instincts beneath their logic, they risk mistaking rationalization for reason and belief for truth. The self is a convenient lie. What most people call the self, that coherent, stable identity they believe resides deep within them, is largely a construct assembled from memory, language, expectation, and repetition. It feels real because it is necessary. It simplifies the chaos of experience into something manageable, gives life narrative structure, and allows society to function. But beneath that convenience lies a more uncomfortable truth. The self is not a solid core. It is a story we tell ourselves to make sense of our place in the world. From a young age, individuals are taught to define themselves. They are given names, genders, nationalities, family roles, and cultural norms. These labels begin to form the skeleton of identity. As life progresses, personality traits, careers, beliefs, and social affiliations are layered on. People build a sense of, I am this and I am not that. But what if none of this is fixed? What if the self is more like a costume closet than a temple? Buddhist philosophy has long pointed to this illusion. The concept of anatta, or non-self, proposes that what we think of as I is just a constantly shifting collection of sensations, thoughts, and perceptions. There is no unchanging entity behind the experience, just experience itself. Neuroscience increasingly supports this view. The brain has no central command center labeled self. It is a network of modules that light up and quiet down depending on the context. The feeling of a singular me is just that, a feeling, not a fact. The brain craves coherence. It constructs a continuous identity by stitching together fragmented memories and momentary impulses. But memory is unreliable. It distorts, erases, invents. And behavior is inconsistent. People act differently in different situations. They are kinder with strangers than with family, braver in crowds than alone, more honest in private than public. Which version is the real self? The answer is none and all. The self also functions as a social tool. In conversation, people refer to their identity as if it were stable. I'm not that kind of person. That's just who I am. These statements create predictability. They tell others what to expect. But they also trap individuals in their own narratives. Someone who identifies as strong may suppress grief. Someone who identifies as intellectual may ignore emotion. Identity becomes performance, and the self becomes a prison guarded by its own mythology. Consumer culture exploits this lie. People are sold products not just to satisfy needs, but to reinforce identity. Clothes, cars, brands, and lifestyles become extensions of who I am. The market doesn't just sell things, it sells selves. And the more people invest in maintaining their image, the more they confuse the image with reality. The idea of the self is convenient because it gives life direction and meaning, but it's a lie because it implies permanence and singularity in a world defined by change. Letting go of the self doesn't mean losing purpose. It means gaining freedom. It means recognizing that you are not a fixed noun, but a shifting verb, an ongoing process, not a static product. Education breaks originality in the name of order. At its core, modern education is designed not to awaken creativity, but to impose structure. From the first day of school, children are introduced to systems, schedules, rules, standardized assessments, and hierarchies. They are taught that there is a right way to think, a correct answer to give, and a predetermined path to follow. What begins as a child's natural curiosity is slowly redirected toward compliance. Originality is not banned outright, it is merely reshaped to fit within boundaries acceptable to the institution. Standardized testing is one of the clearest expressions of this principle. It rewards conformity, not innovation. It teaches students that success lies in selecting the correct answer from a limited set of options, not in asking new questions. Students learn to memorize rather than imagine, to recall rather than create. In this way, education becomes a system of filters, not to identify the most thoughtful minds, but the most obedient. Those who deviate, question, or think laterally are often labeled as disruptive, unfocused, or underachieving. Even subjects that claim to promote creativity, art, literature, music, are usually taught within rigid frameworks. Art must be graded. Essays must follow a rubric. Expression must be legible to evaluators. The result is a quiet erosion of true originality. Students learn early what kind of creativity is rewarded and what kind is ignored. Over time, many abandon their own voice for the sake of approval. This conditioning runs deeper than academics. Education shapes how people see the world. It teaches them to categorize, to compartmentalize, to interpret reality through lenses approved by authorities. It teaches history as a linear narrative, with heroes and villains already assigned. It teaches science as a closed system of facts rather than a dynamic process of discovery and doubt. It teaches literature as a series of themes to decode rather than a mirror to reflect inner life. The student becomes less an explorer of knowledge and more a consumer of prepackaged truths. The obsession with order extends beyond content to behavior. Students are taught to sit still, raise their hands, wait their turn, follow directions. These lessons are not about learning, they are about control. The ideal student is one who complies. The institution does not reward those who challenge its structure. It praises those who internalize it. By the time students graduate, many have learned to regulate themselves according to expectations they never consciously chose. The irony is that society claims to value originality. Employers want creative thinkers, and universities advertise their encouragement of innovation. But these are buzzwords. What is often wanted is novelty within limits, ideas that are fresh but not threatening, different but still profitable, bold but still legible to those in power. True originality, ideas that upend systems, reframe assumptions, or question foundational norms, rarely survives within the traditional educational model. Education, as it currently exists, is not designed to cultivate uniqueness. It is designed to produce stability. It creates predictable citizens, productive workers, and manageable minds. And while there are exceptions, brilliant teachers, alternative schools, rebellious students, the system itself bends toward order. In doing so, it sacrifices originality at the altar of efficiency. It trains people to fit in before they ever get the chance to find out who they are. Your suffering has no meaning unless you create it. Pain in its rawest form is just sensation, biological, emotional, psychological distress. It doesn't come with inherent purpose or moral weight. A broken heart, a loss, a betrayal, an illness? These things happen to people every day, not because of some cosmic plan or spiritual lesson, but because life is chaotic, indifferent, and often cruel. The universe does not explain itself. Nature does not pause to justify the hurricane, the cancer, or the famine. And so, when suffering arrives, it comes empty, void of interpretation, direction, or inherent meaning. Yet human beings cannot live with chaos. The mind seeks order, even in agony. When people suffer, they ask why, not just in the causal sense, but existentially. Why me? What is this for? What am I meant to learn? These are not scientific questions. They are acts of desperation, attempts to impose coherence on what feels unbearable. And this is where meaning enters, not as a gift, but as a decision. Meaning is not something found in suffering, it is something forged through it. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, understood this intimately. In the most dehumanizing conditions imaginable, he observed that those who survived were often those who could create meaning in their pain. They didn't wait for their suffering to be explained. They gave it purpose. They turned it into defiance, into love, into future intention. Meaning, in this sense, becomes an act of rebellion against despair. But it doesn't happen automatically. Many people suffer and never emerge. Trauma, if left uninterpreted, doesn't enlighten. It disfigures. Pain can harden, isolate, or destroy. It can become an endless loop of self-pity, bitterness, or numbness. The idea that suffering automatically makes people stronger is false. It only becomes transformative if the individual chooses to engage with it, if they decide, consciously or not, to assign it meaning. Otherwise, it remains a wound without narrative. This is the double-edged sword of human consciousness. People can make meaning out of anything, but they must choose to do so. Suffering is not noble on its own. It does not elevate a person just because it exists. Its value is entirely dependent on what one does with it. A breakup can become either the end of self-worth or the beginning of self-discovery. A failure can lead to resignation or reinvention. The pain is the same. The meaning is not. Creating meaning doesn't mean lying to oneself. It means choosing a perspective that empowers rather than destroys. It means framing suffering as part of a larger story, one where the individual is not just a victim, but a participant. This doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't justify the injustice. But it transforms the experience into something survivable, even sacred. Ultimately, suffering is inevitable. What isn't inevitable is what it becomes. People are not defined by what happens to them, but by how they interpret what happens. The universe won't give pain a reason, but humans can. And in doing so, they reclaim power over the one thing that always felt out of their control. The masses crave their chains. This isn't just a cynical remark, it's a disturbing observation about how deeply conditioned human beings are to prefer security over freedom, familiarity over risk, and obedience over responsibility. People don't simply accept their constraints, they often defend them, celebrate them, and pass them on to the next generation. The chains are not just tolerated, they are polished, decorated, and proudly worn. Freedom is frightening. It demands decision, accountability, and the courage to stand alone. Most people don't want that burden. They want to be told what to do, how to think, and where to go. They want institutions to validate their beliefs, authorities to manage their fears, and systems to organize their confusion. True freedom is raw and unpredictable. It requires facing uncertainty without a guidebook. So instead, people choose comfort disguised as order. They trade autonomy for approval. Religion offers one form of chains, rules, doctrines, and moral absolutes. These provide certainty in a chaotic world. Followers are relieved of the need to question deeply or take existential responsibility. If they follow the commandments, pray correctly, and submit to divine authority, they are promised salvation. The rigidity of the belief system becomes soothing. It structures time, behavior, and even thought. And for many, stepping outside of that structure feels not liberating, but terrifying. They will defend the system not because it makes sense, but because it makes life bearable. The same pattern applies to political ideologies. People align themselves with movements or parties not because they have examined every nuance, but because belonging gives them identity. They adopt the slogans, mimic the outrage, and conform to the group's moral language. The ideology becomes a ready-made belief system that relieves the burden of individual analysis. To challenge the ideology, even in thought, feels like betrayal. The chains are invisible, but they're tightly fastened, built from tribal loyalty and fear of exile. Consumer culture deepens the craving for captivity. It teaches people that happiness lies in products, status, and the constant chase of more. The average person becomes enslaved to debt, advertisements, and dopamine. They spend their lives working for things they were taught to want, competing in games they never agreed to play. They are told they are free because they can choose between brands, but every choice is already within the system's design. The marketplace feels like freedom, but it is merely a well-decorated cage. Education, too, rewards those who adapt to the mold. Students learn early that questioning the structure is dangerous. Good grades come to those who memorize, not those who challenge. The result is generations of well-behaved citizens, trained not to think independently, but to perform intelligence within safe parameters. By adulthood, many can no longer distinguish between their own thoughts and those given to them. They crave structure because they were never taught how to live without it. The masses do not simply endure their chains. They cling to them. They fear the unknown more than they resent their captivity. Freedom is available, but costly. It requires solitude, inner conflict, and the collapse of illusions. So most people stay where they are, bound, obedient, and convinced that their cage is the world. Peace is often enforced through invisible violence. When most people think of peace, they imagine the absence of war, bloodshed, or overt conflict. Streets are quiet, laws are followed, and life moves forward in apparent harmony. But beneath this calm surface, power operates in subtle, pervasive ways. The violence hasn't disappeared, it's simply changed form. It no longer needs guns or prisons to keep people in line. It uses laws, narratives, and psychological manipulation. The result is a peace that looks serene but is maintained by silent coercion. Invisible violence is the force that makes people comply without being told. It's the fear of losing one's job for speaking out. It's the unspoken rule that certain topics are off limits in polite conversation. It's the quiet pressure to act normal, to keep smiling, to not disrupt the social fabric. No one may be pointing a weapon, but the fear is real. The boundaries are known, and stepping outside them comes with consequences, social, financial, emotional, that are just as effective as physical threats. Governments often achieve this kind of peace through surveillance and bureaucracy. People are watched, not just by cameras, but by data collection, algorithms, and behavioral tracking. The awareness that one's actions are being monitored is enough to regulate behavior. There's no need to jail someone if they can be made to police themselves. This is power without spectacle, discipline without drama. The citizen believes they are free, even as they live inside an invisible grid of constraints. Media plays a central role in this form of control. It sets the tone for what is acceptable and what is deviant. By controlling the narrative, it frames dissent as danger and obedience as virtue. The stories people consume shape what they believe is real, what they believe is possible. When peace is portrayed as the absence of agitation, then anyone who agitates, by questioning norms, exposing corruption, or expressing rage, is seen not as a truth-teller, but as a threat. Silence becomes synonymous with safety. Education also enforces invisible peace. Schools teach compliance in subtle ways, through authority structures, standardized testing, and behavioral norms. Children learn that following rules and staying quiet earns rewards. Creativity and rebellion are tolerated only within pre-approved limits. The system doesn't need to suppress outright, it teaches suppression from within. By the time students become adults, many no longer need external discipline. They've internalized it, they've learned to confuse comfort with peace. Even relationships and family structures reflect this dynamic. Social roles often pressure individuals to conform to expectations that feel suffocating but remain unchallenged because they are normalized. The pressure to be agreeable, to not make a scene, to keep family matters private, all are examples of how emotional compliance is framed as harmony. But this kind of peace often requires the silencing of real needs, truths, and pain. Peace maintained through invisible violence is fragile. It looks stable, but it depends on fear, silence, and control. It does not heal conflict, it suppresses it. And while it may prevent chaos in the short term, it often produces deeper unrest over time. True peace does not require the erasure of tension. It requires space for it to be seen, spoken, and transformed. But when the illusion of peace is more valued than truth, violence simply hides behind the mask of civility. Happiness is overvalued and rarely honest. In a world obsessed with feeling good, happiness has been elevated to the status of ultimate life goal. People chase it in relationships, in careers, in material possessions, and even in self-help routines. But what if happiness, as it's commonly pursued and portrayed, is not only overrated, but largely fabricated? What if the constant demand to be happy is, in itself, a kind of emotional tyranny, one that distorts reality, punishes honesty, and masks deeper truths? Happiness has become a performance. Social media is filled with curated images of joy, smiling faces, romantic dinners, vacation sunsets. But these snapshots are not spontaneous reflections of emotional truth. They are carefully staged moments designed to signal that one is winning at life. Behind the scenes, people often feel anxious, disconnected, or numb. Yet the expectation to be happy pressures them to present a version of themselves that doesn't exist. The result is a society where everyone pretends for everyone else and no one admits what they really feel. The pressure to be happy also makes it harder to process suffering. Pain, grief, uncertainty. These are treated as temporary detours on the road to happiness rather than valid, essential experiences. People are told to stay positive, look on the bright side, or choose happiness, as if complex emotional states can be bypassed with a mindset trick. This demand for constant optimism leads to repression, not resolution. It teaches people to hide their struggles instead of learning from them. Even the idea of happiness itself is vague and constantly shifting. What does it mean to be happy? Is it a fleeting emotion? A sustained state? A lifestyle brand? The ambiguity allows for constant marketing. Companies promise happiness through products. Gurus promise it through programs. Governments promise it through economic stability. But none of these offer real emotional depth. They offer stimulation, distraction, or validation, but not meaning. Happiness, as sold by modern culture, is shallow. In truth, many of life's most meaningful experiences come not from happiness, but from tension, discomfort, and even pain. Growth often requires struggle. Compassion is born from suffering. Wisdom comes from failure, not joy. But because happiness is so overvalued, these deeper aspects of life are neglected or seen as problems to be fixed. People begin to pathologize normal human emotions. Sadness becomes depression, doubt becomes weakness, and quiet becomes emptiness. Happiness is also deeply subjective and context-dependent. What brings joy to one may be meaningless to another. Yet society pushes a one-size-fits-all model, wealth, status, success, pleasure, as the blueprint for happiness. This creates a system where people measure themselves against ideals that may not resonate with their true values. They feel inadequate not because they are unhappy, but because they are not happy in the way they're told they should be. Perhaps the greatest dishonesty about happiness is the belief that it is a permanent state. Life is not built for emotional permanence. It flows, it contracts and expands. The demand to feel good all the time is not only unrealistic, it's inhuman. By chasing happiness as a constant goal, people miss the richness of experience that comes from being fully alive, even when that means feeling sorrow, confusion, or emptiness. Happiness has its place. But when it becomes the only acceptable emotion, it stops being a gift and becomes a burden. Selflessness can be a hidden form of self-hatred. It sounds noble to put others first, to give, to serve, to sacrifice. Society often praises this as the highest moral virtue. But when selflessness becomes chronic, compulsive, or one-sided, it's rarely coming from love. More often, it's rooted in avoidance, guilt, or a lack of self-worth. Underneath the surface of constant giving can lie a deeper truth. The person has been conditioned to believe they don't matter unless they are useful to others. Many people who live selflessly were taught early on that their needs were inconvenient. They learned to anticipate others' emotions before understanding their own. Maybe they grew up in chaotic households where caretaking was expected of them, or in environments where approval was conditional. Over time, they internalized a dangerous lesson. They are only lovable when they disappear. They began to equate value with sacrifice, identity with erasure. On the outside, these people may look like saints. They're the first to volunteer, the last to speak up for themselves, and the ones others depend on. But on the inside, they may feel empty, unappreciated, or even resentful. They rarely ask for help. They deflect compliments. They're uncomfortable receiving attention. Because deep down, they don't believe they deserve care. They believe they have to earn it by being endlessly selfless. This kind of selflessness is not generosity. It's self-erasure. It's a subtle form of self-hatred dressed up as virtue. When someone cannot set boundaries, when they cannot say no without guilt, when they feel panic at the thought of prioritizing their own needs, that is not kindness. That is a symptom of a damaged self-concept. They have been trained to disappear in exchange for love. The irony is that this pattern often backfires. Chronic selflessness can lead to burnout, resentment, and emotional collapse. Relationships built on this dynamic are usually unbalanced. The giver becomes exhausted, while the receiver becomes dependent, or worse, entitled. When the selfless person finally breaks down or asks for something, they are often met with confusion or disappointment because they trained others to expect their silence and compliance. There's also a subtle arrogance in compulsive selflessness. It implies that only they can fix things, only they can carry the burden, only they can make sacrifices. It turns martyrdom into identity. But underneath this is often a refusal to face vulnerability, to admit that they too need love, care, and space. Instead of acknowledging their pain, they try to outrun it by focusing on others. It's easier to fix someone else than to confront the belief that you are unworthy of being fixed yourself. True compassion must include the self. Healthy selflessness is a choice, not a compulsion. It arises from fullness, not emptiness. It respects limits. It gives without erasing the giver. But when selflessness becomes a pattern of self-abandonment, it no longer heals. It hides. It doesn't come from love. It comes from the belief that love must be earned by disappearing. And in that disappearance, the self is quietly sacrificed again and again in the name of being good. Power doesn't corrupt. It reveals. This phrase challenges the common belief that power changes people. In reality, it strips away the masks they wore when they were constrained. When someone gains power, social, political, financial, it doesn't implant new character traits. It simply removes the consequences that once kept those traits hidden. The polite man becomes cruel not because power transformed him, but because now he no longer needs to pretend. The quiet woman becomes tyrannical, not because leadership changed her, but because it finally gave her permission to speak the way she always wanted. Most people are not entirely good or evil. They're tactical. They behave based on context. In positions of weakness or anonymity, they adapt, appease, and camouflage. Social norms, fear of judgment, or lack of authority keep many destructive tendencies in check. But give someone immunity from criticism, control over others, and access to influence, and a new version of them often emerges. Or rather, an old version that was always there, waiting. This is why power is such a precise diagnostic tool. It accelerates self-exposure. A kind person with power tends to become more generous. A cruel person becomes more dangerous. Power amplifies what is already present. It removes the pressure to conform and replaces it with the freedom to act without consequence. And that freedom is revealing. History is full of examples. Revolutionaries who once spoke of justice and equality often become authoritarian when given control. The oppressed, when rising to power, sometimes replicate the same structures they once fought against. The reason is not that power magically corrupts. It's that power grants access to what was always hidden, a hunger for control, unresolved rage, the desire to dominate, or the need for validation. When there's no longer anyone to say no, the internal becomes external. This applies not just to politics or leadership, but to everyday life. Watch how people treat waitstaff, subordinates, or those they don't need to impress. Their behavior in these moments is more telling than how they behave in public or in situations where they have something to lose. When they believe no one important is watching, their true nature surfaces. Power doesn't turn them into something new. It simply removes the pressure to be someone else. Social media has also made this process more visible. Give someone an audience, and suddenly they begin to reveal what they think, believe, or feel, often without filters. Fame, like political power, erodes boundaries. The performer begins to show the person behind the performance. And sometimes that person is darker than anyone imagined. Power is not inherently negative. It can reveal strength, compassion, leadership, and clarity. It can magnify wisdom. But it is never neutral. It always exposes. This is why those who seek power most aggressively are often the least suited to wield it. They are not drawn to serve, they are drawn to express what has long been repressed. The question is not what power will do to a person. The question is what is already within them, waiting for the opportunity to emerge. Power does not forge character. It unmasks it. Discipline was invented to normalize obedience. While discipline is often celebrated as a personal virtue associated with self-control, strength, and success, it also has a darker, more systemic origin. Beyond personal growth, discipline has long been used as a mechanism to shape human behavior into predictable, manageable forms. It was not born from a desire to help individuals thrive. It was designed to help institutions function. Its true purpose wasn't to make people free, it was to make them governable. Foucault described this shift in Discipline and Punish, where he explored how power moved from brute force to subtle conditioning. In earlier societies, control was enacted through visible punishment, public executions, torture, exile. But modern systems developed more refined methods. Schools, prisons, factories, and military barracks didn't rely on overt violence. They used structure, repetition, and constant observation. They created environments where people internalized control, regulating themselves without needing to be told. In this sense, discipline is a psychological architecture. It teaches people to wake up on time, to sit still, to follow instructions, to speak only when asked, and to accept evaluation as normal. From an early age, these behaviors are reinforced through praise, punishment, and comparison. Over time, the individual no longer sees these routines as external impositions. They see them as personal standards. Obedience becomes virtue. Compliance becomes character. Workplaces replicate the same structure. Employees are rewarded for punctuality, measured productivity, and silence. They are told to be professional, which often means hiding emotion, avoiding dissent, and adhering to hierarchical expectations. The disciplined worker is one who doesn't just perform tasks, but internalizes the system's values. They believe that staying within the lines is a mark of responsibility, when in fact it may simply be a sign of successful conditioning. Discipline also has a moral coating. It is praised not just as practical, but as noble. A disciplined person is seen as respectable, trustworthy, even superior. But this framing obscures a deeper truth, that discipline often operates in service of power. It keeps people within systems that exploit them. It trains individuals to prioritize duty over desire, rules over questioning, productivity over purpose. What's called laziness is often just a refusal to submit to arbitrary standards. What's labeled failure is sometimes resistance. In education, discipline is used to homogenize. Schools prioritize control over curiosity. Students are graded not only on performance, but on behavior. The bell dictates movement. the teacher dictates pace, the curriculum dictates thought. Children learn to associate learning with obedience. Originality becomes a threat to order. Those who resist the structure are medicated or marginalized. Even in self-help culture, discipline is sold as the key to happiness. Wake up at 5 a.m., meditate, exercise, grind, optimize. But rarely is the question asked, to what end? Are people being disciplined to fulfill their own vision or to become more efficient cogs in someone else's machine? Without clarity, discipline becomes another form of quiet submission. It gives the illusion of control while silently reinforcing conformity. Discipline, when chosen with awareness, can be powerful, but when imposed without question, it becomes a tool of normalization. It teaches people not how to think, but how to obey, and to call that obedience strength. You're not evolving, you're adapting to cages. What many people call personal growth is often just clever adaptation to limitations they didn't choose. It's not evolution, it's survival. It's learning how to breathe in a shrinking room and convincing yourself the air is fresher than ever. Modern life is filled with systems that restrict, direct, and control. Instead of breaking free, people learn to excel within them. They become specialists in constraint, masters of coping with a reality that was never designed with their freedom in mind. School trains this early. Children don't evolve into thinkers, they adapt into performers. They learn to pass tests, not to question why those tests exist. They memorize instead of explore. They become fluent in approval, experts in pleasing authority figures. Creativity is not nurtured, it's conditioned into safe, marketable forms. By the time they graduate, they've been molded, not into fuller versions of themselves, but into efficient products for the workforce. The cage becomes so familiar, it no longer feels like confinement. Work reinforces the illusion. People believe they are progressing because they earn promotions, receive titles, and accumulate credentials. But these are often just higher levels within the same structure. More responsibility, more stress, more compliance, but rarely more freedom. The boundaries remain fixed. Most jobs don't ask people to be visionary. They ask them to be dependable. Success becomes defined not by innovation or truth, but by how well someone conforms to the roles assigned to them. You're praised for growing, but only if your growth reinforces the existing hierarchy. Technology was supposed to liberate. Instead, it tethered people to a new kind of prison, one made of pixels, metrics, and constant surveillance. Social media tells people to be authentic, while rewarding those who are algorithmically optimized. People learn to brand themselves, edit themselves, and filter their own thoughts. They adapt to attention economies that demand engagement over depth, spectacle over substance. Their expression becomes strategic. Their identity becomes a product. This isn't evolution, it's conditioning in high definition. Even emotionally, people are adapting to cages. They manage trauma not by healing it, but by performing resilience. They cope by minimizing their pain, aestheticizing their struggle, and calling it strength. Instead of dismantling the systems that cause suffering, whether personal, cultural, or systemic, they learn to smile through it. They are celebrated for not complaining, for pushing through, for staying productive in the face of burnout. Their ability to function inside the cage becomes a badge of honor. They call it maturity. Evolution implies expansion, transformation, transcendence, but adaptation often means shrinkage. It's the mind bending itself to fit into a container. It's the soul whispering in a world that demands silence. It's the self contorting to avoid rejection or punishment. And because this adaptation is praised, it becomes harder to question. People think they're growing, when really they're just surviving more skillfully. True evolution isn't about adjusting to cages, it's about noticing them. It's about asking who built them, why you accepted them, and whether they still deserve your presence. Without that awareness, what you call growth is just compliance with a higher level of control. And no matter how refined your performance becomes, it still takes place inside walls. Meaning is a drug to silence existential terror. Human consciousness is both a gift and a curse. With it comes the ability to reflect, to dream, to plan, but also to recognize mortality, randomness, and the lack of inherent order in the universe. The mind stares into the abyss and sees no script, no purpose, no cosmic instruction manual. This recognition produces a profound anxiety, existential terror. It's the quiet panic that underlies so much of human behavior, the unspoken fear that none of it matters, and everything will end. To escape this unbearable tension, people reach for meaning, not because it's true, but because it soothes. Meaning operates like a drug. It dulls the edge of uncertainty. It wraps chaos in narrative. It gives people a reason to keep going, a story to belong to. Whether it's religion, nationalism, love, success, or personal growth, meaning functions as a stabilizer. It takes the fragmented experience of life and organizes it into something coherent. But coherence is not the same as truth. People don't necessarily believe in meaning because it's rational. They believe in it because it's comforting. Religion is one of the most potent forms of this drug. It doesn't just provide answers, it provides absolute answers. It explains suffering, assigns moral structure, and promises continuity after death. It allows people to feel watched, protected, and purposeful. But these beliefs often arise not from evidence, but from the unbearable nature of confronting the void. The more terrifying the unknown, the more powerful the need for certainty becomes. Faith becomes a defense mechanism, not a discovery. Even secular meaning systems function the same way. People pour their existential energy into work, relationships, political causes, or creative endeavors. These pursuits give them identity and direction, but often mask deeper fears. The entrepreneur who chases endless productivity may be running from the fear of insignificance. The activist who shouts the loudest may be drowning out inner emptiness. The romantic who idealizes love may be seeking refuge from the void. Each of these forms of meaning offers temporary relief, like a hit of morphine against a pain that never fully goes away. The modern obsession with finding your purpose is another symptom. The idea that everyone has a singular, special role to fulfill is deeply seductive. It transforms ordinary existence into a quest. But for many, this quest is less about truth and more about distraction. It offers the illusion that life is a puzzle waiting to be solved, rather than a condition to be endured. The search for meaning becomes a shield against the silence of the universe. This doesn't mean meaning is worthless. It can inspire beauty, compassion, and resilience. But it must be recognized for what it is: a psychological necessity, not a cosmic fact. Meaning doesn't exist out there. It's manufactured within. And its power lies in its ability to anesthetize the terror of being a conscious animal in a blind, indifferent universe. The real courage is not in finding meaning. It's in seeing the void and choosing to live anyway. Not because the story is true, but because the alternative is paralysis. Meaning is the story we write to stay sane. It's the drug we take to keep moving through the dark. Most friendships are transactional. People like to believe their friendships are built on pure affection, shared values, or emotional connection. But in reality, most of these relationships operate on an unspoken system of exchange. Time, energy, emotional labor, status, attention. These are the currencies of friendship. The transactions may not involve money, but they still involve costs and benefits. People gravitate toward those who offer them something: companionship, validation, advice, entertainment, or even just distraction. And when that something disappears, so often does the friendship. This doesn't mean people are cold or calculating. The transactional nature of friendship is often unconscious. It's baked into the rhythms of interaction. You listen to someone's problems because they listen to yours. You show up to their event because they came to yours. You tolerate their flaws because you know they tolerate yours. The give and take may not be equal, but it's usually balanced enough to feel fair. When that balance tips, resentment builds. If one person becomes the consistent giver and the other the taker, the relationship begins to decay. Social status also plays a hidden role. Many friendships are built around proximity and utility, not deep connection. Coworkers bond because it makes the workplace more tolerable. Classmates become friends because they see each other every day. Neighbors connect because of shared space, not shared soul. These bonds often dissolve when the context changes. Someone switches jobs, moves away, or no longer serves a functional role in the other's life. The friendship ends not with malice, but with indifference. The transaction is complete. Even emotional support, often seen as the purest aspect of friendship, can carry transactional undertones. People expect reciprocity. If you're always there for someone but they're never there for you, the imbalance becomes hard to ignore. There's an internal scoreboard, subtle but very real. And while true generosity exists, most people have emotional limits. They'll give until they feel it's no longer returned. Then the resentment creeps in, followed by distance, then silence. This pattern becomes more visible during life changes. When someone experiences success, financial, social, romantic, their friendships often shift. Some people draw closer to bask in the new status. Others fade away out of jealousy or insecurity. The underlying dynamic is exposed. The friendship was never truly about the person. It was about what they symbolized or provided. The same happens with failure. When someone goes through hardship, friends may initially offer support. But if the struggle continues, many disappear. The emotional cost becomes too high. Of course, not all friendships are hollow. Some survive change, endure imbalance, and resist utility. But these are rare. They are exceptions, not the rule. Most friendships exist because they serve a mutual purpose, even if that purpose is simply shared loneliness or mutual distraction. When that purpose fades, so does the connection. To recognize this isn't to become cynical. It's to see the structure beneath the sentiment. Understanding the transactional nature of most friendships allows people to engage with them more honestly, not expecting permanence from what was born out of circumstance and not mistaking shared moments for unconditional loyalty. Success is often a sign of deep conformity. In modern society, success is celebrated as the highest individual achievement, evidence of intelligence, discipline, ambition, and hard work. But behind the trophies, accolades, and promotions lies a less glamorous truth. Success often rewards those who master the system, not those who challenge it. It favors those who follow the rules better than others, who adapt themselves to existing structures, and who embody the values that the dominant culture deems desirable. In this light, success is not rebellion, it's alignment. Look at the traditional markers of success: high-paying jobs, prestigious degrees, luxury homes, social recognition. These rewards aren't handed out for originality or dissent. They're earned by those who know how to play the game. To succeed in school, students must memorize standardized information, follow instructions, and perform for exams. To succeed in corporations, workers must navigate hierarchies, meet metrics, suppress conflict, and protect reputations. These environments reward predictability and penalize disruption. Creativity is allowed, but only within controlled bounds. Even in fields like art or entertainment, where originality is supposedly king, success often depends on marketability, relatability, and timing. Artists who break through often do so not just because of talent, but because their message aligns with current trends or cultural appetites. The truly avant-garde, those who challenge the foundation of aesthetic norms or moral sensibilities, are often ignored or condemned. The market does not reward the most daring, it rewards the most sellable. Social conformity plays a massive role as well. Successful individuals tend to mirror the values and behaviors of their social environment. They dress the part, speak the language, and learn to suppress impulses that might alienate others. They become fluent in diplomacy, restraint, and self-presentation. Their success is not necessarily a reflection of authenticity, but of strategic mimicry. They fit in, and because they fit in, they rise. This isn't to say that successful people lack intelligence or effort, but their achievements are often the result of mastering systems that favor certain personalities, appearances, and backgrounds. Those who are neurodivergent, emotionally intense, rebellious, or radically creative may be just as intelligent and hard-working, but they do not conform, and therefore they do not ascend as easily. The system does not reward outliers, it neutralizes them. Success also requires compromise. Ambition often demands silence in the face of injustice, politeness in the face of exploitation, and tolerance of mediocrity when truth would threaten the structure. Many who rise learn when to look away, when to flatter, and when to retreat. They are not rewarded for courage, they are rewarded for calculation. And the higher they climb, the more invested they become in protecting the structure that elevated them. True revolutionaries are rarely considered successful in their own time. They are inconvenient. Their success comes later, often posthumously, when society is finally ready to absorb their discomforting message. But in the present, it is the conformist who thrives, the one who learns not just how to work within the system, but how to become its most polished representative. Success in this way becomes a mirror not of brilliance, but of deep, skillful conformity. Identity politics is a symptom of deeper power struggles. At first glance, identity politics appears to be about representation, about giving voice to marginalized groups and addressing historic inequalities. But underneath the rhetoric of justice and inclusion lies a more complex reality. Identity politics often functions as a proxy for battles over power, access, and legitimacy. It is not just about who people are. It is about who gets to speak, who gets to lead, and who gets to define the rules of engagement. The rise of identity-based movements has coincided with a broader fragmentation of traditional political ideologies. Where once the struggle was framed around class or ideology, now it is more frequently framed around identity, race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity. These categories become organizing principles, drawing lines between insiders and outsiders, victims and oppressors, allies and enemies. But these lines are not fixed. They are constantly being negotiated, manipulated, and contested, often by those seeking to gain or preserve influence. Identity politics thrives in environments where institutional trust has eroded and where people feel invisible within traditional power structures. When political parties, media, and corporations fail to address systemic problems, individuals turn to identity as a framework for asserting agency. But as these identities become politicized, they also become commodified. Groups form not just to demand recognition, but to claim space, jobs, funding, influence, moral authority. Identity becomes currency in a marketplace of attention and legitimacy. This leads to a paradox. Movements that begin with the goal of liberation can become locked in a perpetual struggle for validation. Victimhood becomes power. Marginalization becomes capital. The more a group can demonstrate its exclusion, the stronger its claim for inclusion. This creates an incentive structure where grievance becomes a pathway to influence, and where competing identities can find themselves in zero-sum conflicts over symbolic and material resources. Power brokers, politicians, corporations, and institutions recognize this dynamic and often exploit it. By adopting the language of identity politics, they signal progressiveness while avoiding structural change. A corporation may diversify its board without altering its labor practices. A university may celebrate cultural heritage while raising tuition. Representation is used as a shield to protect the existing hierarchy. The focus shifts from dismantling systems to diversifying the faces that manage them. This is not to say that identity doesn't matter. It profoundly shapes lived experience. But when identity becomes the primary lens for politics, it risks reducing individuals to categories and obscuring shared interests. Class, labor, economic inequality. These universal concerns often get sidelined in favor of more divisive narratives. The system thrives on fragmentation. It benefits when people are too busy fighting over representation to unite over redistribution. Identity politics, then, is not the disease. It is a symptom of deeper alienation, inequality, and institutional failure. It reflects the desire to be seen, heard, and valued. But if the focus remains solely on identity, without examining the machinery of power that exploits all identities, then the struggle becomes performative. Real change requires moving beyond the surface and asking harder questions, not just about who we are, but about who benefits from the way identity is used. Love can be ownership with perfume. What is often described as love, romantic, passionate, intense, is sometimes just control dressed in sweet language and sentimental gestures. People say they love someone, but what they really mean is, "You belong to me." In this dynamic, love is not a gift freely given. It's a transaction with hidden terms. The perfume is affection, attention, and desire. But beneath the fragrance, something more possessive lurks. From an early age, people are taught to associate love with exclusivity, control, and even entitlement. Phrases like, "You're mine," or "I can't live without you," are considered romantic, but they imply dependency and possession. The idea of a partner being someone to own, protect, or complete us can sound noble, but it often masks a deeper psychological contract. When love is used to claim territory over another person's time, body, thoughts, or future, it stops being love and becomes something else: soft domination. This kind of ownership doesn't always look abusive or toxic. In fact, it's often accompanied by grand gestures, public declarations, and deeply emotional moments. But the emotion becomes a tool. Jealousy is excused as passion. Monitoring becomes concern. Limiting someone's freedom is rebranded as care. Over time, the partner being loved may begin to feel suffocated, not by cruelty, but by the weight of someone else's expectations. The leash is made of silk, but it's a leash nonetheless. Love that becomes ownership often has little tolerance for individuality. The partner is expected to mold themselves around the desires of the other. Their autonomy becomes a threat. Their friendships, ambitions, even moods are policed, subtly or overtly. The more one person invests in controlling the other, the more love is used to justify it. "I only do this because I love you" becomes the excuse for every intrusion, every demand, every boundary crossed. This behavior isn't always malicious. It often stems from fear of abandonment, insecurity, or the desperate need for certainty in an unpredictable world. People cling tightly to what they think they might lose. But in doing so, they can crush the very thing they claim to cherish. Real love requires space, not confinement. It honors change, not stagnation. When love becomes a means of possessing another human being, it loses its authenticity and becomes a subtle form of emotional capture. Society often reinforces this confusion. Movies, songs, and stories glorify obsessive love, equating intensity with depth. The more someone sacrifices, the more they surveil, the more they ache in the other's absence, the more valid their love is considered. But this script rarely asks whether the person being loved feels seen, respected, or free. The intensity is praised, the autonomy is ignored. Love doesn't have to be ownership, but it often becomes that when people lack the emotional maturity to separate affection from control. True love is not about having someone, it's about witnessing them, supporting them, and letting them be fully themselves, even when it's inconvenient. When love becomes a mirror for one's own insecurities and need for possession, it turns into a beautiful trap, fragrant, dazzling, but ultimately suffocating. It smells like love, but it feels like a cage. Guilt is implanted by religion and culture to prevent rebellion. It doesn't arise naturally in a vacuum. Guilt is not an inherent feature of human consciousness. It is learned, conditioned, and carefully maintained. From early childhood, people are taught to associate certain thoughts, actions, and even feelings with moral failure. Not because those actions are inherently wrong, but because they threaten the social structure that raised them. Guilt becomes a psychological leash, keeping individuals in line long after the external threats of punishment have disappeared. Its power lies in invisibility. People begin to monitor themselves, punishing their own minds for stepping out of bounds. Religion has been one of the most efficient architects of guilt. By creating the concept of sin, often for entirely natural impulses, it turns ordinary human experience into a moral battlefield. Desire becomes temptation. Doubt becomes betrayal. Individual will becomes defiance against divine authority. And because the judgment is said to come from an all-seeing, all-knowing deity, there's no escape. Even when alone, the believer feels watched. Even when nothing is done, guilt can be felt for merely thinking. This constant surveillance internalizes control, making external enforcement less necessary. The system governs from within. But this design isn't just about theology, it's about power. Guilt ensures obedience without force. A person who feels guilty will censor their own voice, suppress their own needs, and often act against their own interests to maintain moral standing. The rules don't have to make sense. They only need to be implanted early and reinforced with emotional consequences. The more guilt a person feels, the less likely they are to rebel. They don't just fear punishment, they believe they deserve it. Culture adds another layer. Guilt becomes encoded in social expectations. Children are taught not just to behave, but to feel bad if they displease. What will people think becomes a constant refrain. Shame is used as a weapon. Conformity is rewarded with belonging, deviation with isolation. The boundaries of acceptable behavior are marked not just with laws or norms, but with invisible emotional landmines. Cross them, and guilt detonates. Even acts of self-assertion can trigger guilt in cultures steeped in obedience. Saying no, setting boundaries, questioning tradition, these are framed as selfish, ungrateful, or disrespectful. The individual is conditioned to feel bad for choosing themselves. And so many stay silent. They comply, not because they believe, but because they fear the internal consequences. The guilt has become reflexive, automatic, invisible. This mechanism serves those in power. Whether it's religious authorities, patriarchal structures, governments, or corporations, guilt keeps people docile. It lowers resistance. It makes people easier to manipulate, to shame, to steer. A guilty population is a compliant one. They will sacrifice their own freedom to feel morally safe. True rebellion begins with the dismantling of implanted guilt. It begins when a person asks, "Whose voice is this in my head? Why do I feel bad for wanting what I want? Who benefits from my self-condemnation?" Because guilt, when examined, often collapses. It thrives in secrecy and shadow. But once it is exposed for what it is, a tool of control, it loses its grip. And only then does real liberation become possible. The family can be the first institution of psychological control. Long before schools, governments, or religions shape the way a person sees the world, the family sets the blueprint. It teaches not only how to behave, but what to believe about love, loyalty, authority, and self-worth. The lessons may not be explicit, but they're absorbed through repetition, silence, tone, and consequence. Parents become the first gods, siblings the first society, and home the first system of rules. What's considered normal is established here, and often it's anything but. In the name of love, families often enforce conformity. Children quickly learn which emotions are acceptable and which are not. Anger may be punished, sadness ignored, and curiosity dismissed. A child who questions too much might be labeled disrespectful. A child who wants autonomy might be told they're selfish. The goal isn't always to nurture individuality, it's to maintain order. And order, in many families, means obedience to the unspoken values of the household. Control can take many forms. It might look like overprotection, where fear is masked as care. The child is not allowed to make mistakes, to explore, to take risks. They are kept emotionally dependent, always doubting their ability to survive on their own. Other times, control comes through guilt. Children are made to feel responsible for the happiness of their parents. They become peacekeepers, mediators, emotional sponges. Their needs are secondary, and expressing them becomes a source of shame. Some families operate on hierarchy rather than mutual respect. Age, title, or tradition become unquestionable sources of authority. In such structures, power is not earned, it's inherited. Elders are right by default, and challenging them is seen as betrayal. The family becomes a miniature version of an authoritarian state where questioning the rules means losing love or being cast out. Even in families that appear functional, the emotional leverage of love can be used to manipulate. "After everything I've done for you" becomes a moral contract that binds the child to a lifetime of compliance. In dysfunctional families, psychological control is more blatant. Gaslighting, favoritism, emotional withdrawal, or excessive praise are used to keep the child in a permanent state of uncertainty. Love becomes conditional. Approval is tied to performance. The child learns to suppress their true self in exchange for acceptance. And because this environment is all they know, they internalize it as the way the world works. The result is often an adult who doubts their instincts, struggles with boundaries, and seeks external validation. They may rebel on the surface, rejecting the family's values, cutting ties, but still carry the internal programming. They might replicate the same patterns in their own relationships, drawn to partners who echo the control they once resented. Escaping the family's influence requires more than physical distance. It requires deconstructing the emotional framework laid down in early life. Not every family operates this way, but when psychological control is present, it is powerful and often invisible. Because it comes wrapped in love, duty, and tradition, it's difficult to confront. But only by acknowledging the ways in which the family can condition belief, suppress identity, and instill fear can true independence begin. Until then, many live not as free individuals, but as loyal citizens of the emotional country they were born into. Philosophy that comforts is not philosophy, it's sedative. Real philosophy is not meant to soothe, it is meant to disturb. It tears through illusions, dismantles inherited beliefs, and forces the thinker to confront uncomfortable truths about self, society, and existence. Its role is not to pat people on the back or tell them everything will be fine. It is to ask, why do you believe what you believe? What happens when you strip meaning away? What are you avoiding when you seek reassurance? When philosophy becomes comforting, it stops being a tool for awakening and becomes a narcotic, a way to numb existential anxiety rather than face it. This is why much of what passes for philosophy today isn't philosophy at all. It's motivational speaking with a classical vocabulary. It offers bite-sized wisdom designed to inspire, not interrogate. The goal is to uplift, to provide certainty, to affirm the reader's current worldview. But true philosophy rarely does that. Nietzsche didn't write to reassure. Neither did Schopenhauer, nor Camus, nor Kierkegaard. Their work unsettles because it pulls at the deepest threads of meaning, identity, and morality. They force readers to sit in discomfort and not run from it. Comfort philosophy often starts with answers instead of questions. It tells people that everything has a reason, that suffering is for a greater good, that all things happen for a purpose. These ideas may feel good, but they require very little intellectual rigor. They offer coherence without inquiry. They bypass the chaos of the human condition by dressing it in certainty. This is not wisdom. It's a lullaby. The need for comfort in philosophy usually comes from fear. Fear of meaninglessness, fear of freedom, fear of the void. When someone is handed comforting philosophy, they're being given a shield against those fears, but not the tools to understand them. They are being protected from themselves rather than introduced to themselves. Real philosophy doesn't shield, it exposes. It forces confrontation with the parts of existence that don't resolve neatly. Take, for example, the difference between a comforting spiritual cliché and existentialist thought. Everything happens for a reason is easy to accept and gives people hope when things fall apart. But Sartre would say there is no inherent meaning, only the meaning one creates. Camus would say the universe is silent and the absurd must be faced head-on. These ideas don't offer relief. They demand responsibility. They don't promise a happy ending. They ask if one is willing to live without one. Philosophy that comforts asks less of its audience. It encourages passive acceptance. It's palatable, popular, and often commercialized. But philosophy that challenges, that forces one to break the mirror and look at the shattered pieces, demands more. It requires self-dismantling, not self-assurance. It asks people to endure disorientation as part of the process of becoming truly conscious. This is why philosophy has always been dangerous to established powers. It threatens dogma. It empowers doubt. It challenges the narratives that keep people docile. A sedative philosophy tells the prisoner the cell is cozy. A real philosophy asks why the cell exists at all, and whether the door has been unlocked the whole time. Great men are hated because they expose the herd. They do not just lead, they reveal. Their presence alone, without intention or malice, acts as a mirror that reflects the mediocrity, conformity, and self-deception of the many. They threaten not by aggression, but by contrast. Their thoughts cut through consensus. Their actions bypass tradition. Their existence unsettles because it reminds the average person of what they are not and what they could be if they dared to deviate. And so the herd reacts not with admiration, but with resentment. The herd is not inherently evil. It is simply the collective default. It thrives on predictability, safety, and sameness. It builds systems that reward obedience and punishes those who move too far outside the lines. It praises innovation only when it is familiar and celebrates rebellion only once it has been safely canonized. Anything too new, too sharp, too real, anything that threatens the delicate fabric of collective delusion is treated as danger. The great man, by refusing to dilute his vision, becomes that danger. Throughout history, those who have reshaped thought, art, science, or ethics have rarely been welcomed. Socrates was executed. Galileo was silenced. Nietzsche was vilified. Malcolm X was assassinated. These figures weren't hated because they did wrong. They were hated because they challenged the narrative. They questioned the moral order, exposed hypocrisies, and demanded intellectual responsibility. Their very being said to the world, "You have accepted less than truth," and the herd could not tolerate that exposure. The psychology of the herd depends on a certain level of mutual reassurance. People validate each other's beliefs, behaviors, and limitations to maintain group cohesion. The great man, by existing outside that circle of reassurance, ruptures the illusion. He thinks in solitude. He speaks without seeking consensus. He lives without apology. This independence is both alluring and terrifying. It reminds others that they too could be free, but aren't. Greatness demands sacrifice, not just in work, but in social belonging. To stand apart is to invite judgment, ridicule, and distortion. The great man is often misunderstood, not because he is unclear, but because clarity is threatening. People twist his words to make them safer. They reduce his legacy to a slogan or strip it of its edge. Only once he is dead or defanged does the herd feel safe enough to praise him. Even those who wish to follow him often fall short. They admire the effect, but avoid the cause. They want the rewards of greatness without the risk. But true greatness cannot be taught like a skill. It arises from vision, courage, and the willingness to stand alone, even when standing alone means being hated by the very society one seeks to elevate. The hatred of great men is not a failure of their character. It is a sign of their impact. They do not destroy the herd. They reveal it. They make visible the invisible chains. And in doing so, they leave behind something the herd cannot ignore: a trail of questions, a challenge to comfort, and a standard too high to forget. To be truly free, you must be willing to be hated. Freedom is not granted. It is seized. And the cost of that seizure is often social rejection. True freedom means speaking, acting, thinking, and choosing without the need for approval. But most people do not want freedom. They want acceptance disguised as independence. They say they want to be free, but what they mean is free without consequences, free without disapproval, free without being misunderstood. But that's not freedom. That's performance. Real freedom begins when the fear of being disliked, judged, or rejected no longer dictates your behavior. From a young age, people are taught to be agreeable. Social harmony is prioritized over authenticity. Children are praised for fitting in, not for standing out. By the time they reach adulthood, many have internalized the idea that being liked is synonymous with being good. So they edit themselves, censor their thoughts, and betray their instincts, all to maintain an image that keeps them within the safe bounds of social approval. In this process, freedom is traded for comfort. The cage is invisible, but it's always there. To break free from that cage is to become a target. Not because you're cruel or reckless, but because independence threatens consensus. When someone lives by their own code, they make others question their own compliance. A person who doesn't apologize for being different makes those who conform feel exposed. And that exposure breeds resentment. Hatred in this context is not always personal. It's a defense mechanism. People hate what reminds them of their own chains. The willingness to be hated is not the same as seeking conflict. It's about being unmoved by it. It's about speaking the truth, even when silence would be easier. It's about holding a boundary, even when guilt is weaponized against you. It's about refusing to betray your values for applause. This kind of clarity is dangerous in a world that depends on ambiguity and compromise. Those who embody it will always attract resistance, not because they are wrong, but because they are ungovernable. Many of history's most revered figures were, in their time, hated. They were mocked, exiled, crucified, or assassinated. Only later were they sanitized, turned into symbols, and celebrated by the very systems that once feared them. Their greatness wasn't defined by their acceptance, it was defined by their refusal to be shaped by it. They lived on their own terms, regardless of the cost. That's the price of true freedom. In personal life, the dynamic is the same. To grow, to evolve, to become who you truly are, you will outgrow relationships, roles, and reputations. Some people will not understand. Some will be angry. Some will rewrite the story to make themselves the victim of your autonomy. But that's part of the process. If you need to be liked by everyone, you will be owned by everyone. Freedom is lonely. It requires strength, self-trust, and the courage to walk alone when the crowd turns. But it also offers something no approval ever can, the ability to live without apology, to think without fear, and to love without conditions. To be truly free, you must be willing to be hated and remain unmoved. Most people are just roles in a script they didn't write. They speak lines they didn't create, pursue goals they didn't question, and follow a path that was laid out for them long before they were old enough to ask, why? From birth, identity is constructed through invisible hands, family expectations, cultural values, religious norms, economic pressures. What appears to be personal choice is often a rehearsed performance. People don't live, they act. They embody roles handed down to them by systems that require order, predictability, and conformity. A child is told, "This is what success looks like," or "This is how a good person behaves." They begin learning the script. Go to school, get good grades, be polite, make your parents proud. Don't make too much noise. Don't ask uncomfortable questions. These cues are repeated so frequently that they're internalized. By the time the child becomes an adult, the lines feel like their own thoughts. But they are not. They are echoes, borrowed convictions mistaken for authenticity. Society assigns roles early: the good son, the obedient daughter, the reliable employee, the loyal citizen, the faithful believer. Each role comes with rules, costumes, and consequences for deviation. Step outside the character too far, and the collective narrative resists. Families' guilt, communities' shame, institutions correct. The punishment for improvising is often subtle but powerful: exclusion, judgment, or isolation. And so people stay in character, not out of passion, but out of fear. Even ambition is scripted. People think they want wealth, fame, or influence because those are the goals that culture rewards. But few ask whether those desires are truly their own. They may spend decades climbing ladders built by someone else, only to reach the top and feel hollow. The applause is loud, but it doesn't fill the silence of not knowing who you are when no one's watching. Social media has amplified this theatrical dynamic. People curate identities, not lives. They perform happiness, success, wisdom, or rebellion, depending on what the algorithm rewards. The performance becomes addictive. The likes are applause. The followers are the audience. But behind the scenes, the actor becomes estranged from the self. The role grows stronger than the person, and when the performance falters, the crisis follows. Who am I without this role? The tragedy is not that people play roles, it's that they forget they're acting. The script becomes the reality. The mask becomes the face. They defend the character even when it no longer fits, clinging to labels that offer stability but prevent transformation. They confuse consistency with integrity, unaware that growth often requires contradiction. A few awaken. They question the plot. They recognize that the script was never theirs. And they begin to improvise, not recklessly, but consciously. They write new lines, break scenes, challenge the narrative. This is not easy. It means walking without a script, risking rejection, and being misunderstood. But it's the only path towards something real. Most people are roles, not out of weakness, but because the script was written before they knew they had the option to change it. The moment they realize they do, everything can begin to shift, not towards certainty, but toward authorship.